Hello, 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 folks. We've got some early birds in chat today. Good to see you all. Welcome, welcome. Hi, Mavi. Hi, Lajor. Good to see you. It's been a very rainy and gloomy gray day here where I live all day. And so I was like, I'll go on and stream and it'll be all grainy or it'll be all rainy and gray outside. And as soon as I started my stream, the sun came out. So I get to look out at the nice, suddenly sunny day while I'm streaming. Still happy to be here, though. Hey, Antasha. Hey, Chris. I'm happy for the rain, though. It's been very hot and dry where I live, so I've been having to water my flowers and everything, and I'm glad the rain did it for me today. You saying the stream brings sunshine into your life? Nice. Yes, absolutely, Lajor. 100%. We're going to get started here in about 1 minute. Hey, Sirius. Good to see you. Hey, Yakechi. All is well indeed. Absolutely. Ladra says, I wish we had rain. It's hot here. Yeah, like I said, I mean, it was really hot. It was unseasonably hot yesterday. So I was glad for the nice, cool weather because the plants like it. I'm going to mute for just a second so I can adjust my microphone. Mavi says, watching on one laptop and chatting in the other to bring up those viewership numbers. Well, thank you, Mavi. I appreciate it. But there's absolutely, you can do that if you want. Absolutely no need to. I know a lot of folks catch this. They catch this stream in reruns on YouTube later on. Although I did want to just throw out there, some folks may not be aware, but there's been some changes that have been made to the 100 Devs Discord recently, and I wanted to point those out because I wasn't even aware of them until recently. There is now even if you're already a member of the Discord, there is now a channels and roles section. So you see where I am up here on the top. So I just wanted to highlight that really quickly. Um, and it's how you can kind of customize your experience on the 100 Devs Discord. Um, and it allows you to easily join a study community, um, more study communities, location based study communities, stuff that you've seen before, such as specifying where you're at in your coding journey. If that's changed, I would suggest updating this. Um, and you can set your pronouns if you'd like to, and then also down here we have go live notifications, and so some of you may have got this today, but there are notifications for 100 devs classes, for stream team streams, for Leon, for me, and for Rufio. So I would highly suggest clicking these if you want to be notified about my streams and about Rufio's streams. And what that'll do is Rufio and I can now do custom pings that will ping everybody who has this role and notify you all before we go live. And when we do use that ping, um, we'll be using it in this particular channel right here, which is the stream team channel on the Discord. So just FYI, yeah. Mavi says I haven't even seen that, and yeah, it hasn't really been advertised. I'm not really sure why, because I think it's a great thing. Just in general, you can really customize your Discord experience, and it's if you just go up here in channels and roles. So I would suggest everybody does that and just review your existing settings and customize those settings if you would like to. Ladra says, Mine, have you seen the site before? Hands on React. I think I've heard about it. I haven't looked at it. I'll have to check that out at some point. Yeah. Yeah, Blah doesn't have to manually assign people to study communities anymore. Yeah. And that's the great thing is that you can customize your study communities here rather than asking to be put in one. You can choose. Um, yeah. So check this out. Check your settings. Also, a little self promotion here. I would highly suggest clicking all of these so that you'll always be notified whether it's Leon, Rufio, or me anytime any of us go live. Oh, I got to turn on closed captions. Give me just a second. Abidemi says, what are we talking about right now? We are talking about a new feature on the 100 Devs Discord that will allow you to customize your Discord experience and your study communities and your notifications. I think it's really great. And I hope at some point there's going to be an announcement about it. But if anybody wants to, you can go in there right now and completely customize your 100 Devs experience. It's on the 100 Devs Discord right here under channels and roles. You probably wouldn't notice it unless it was pointed out. I just happened to stumble upon it one day, and now both Rufio and I and Leon have custom pings. Mine is at Wolfpack, and if you click this icon right here, it will ping you whenever I go live. And also, if you click this one right here, it will ping you whenever Rufio goes live. So highly recommend it. Please do. All right. Oh, closed captions. I have the attention span of a goldfish. All right. No. One second. Okay, captions should be starting momentarily. There we go. Captions should be on. So if you would like to enable closed captions, you should have, if you hover over the right side of your Twitch window, you should have the ability to turn those on or off at will. All right. So what are we talking about today? Well, what we are talking about today is something I'm very excited about. We are continuing our discussion of React. And today we're going to be introducing, we're definitely not going to be fully covering, but we are going to be introducing a really vital concept in React, which is state. So we've talked a little bit, about props before, which is how we can pass things into individual components. But if we're really thinking about React as a solution for our entire user interface as a whole, right? A web page isn't just one or two components, right? It's a bunch of components or a bunch of elements all working together to deliver a unified user experience that can literally react to user inputs and things that are happening within the interface itself. And so really the secret sauce of React is state. And we're going to learn about what state is, how we implement state, and then how we can kind of, control how the interface looks and responds to user actions and other outside influences. Oh, and Latjor points out too, for closed captions, if you don't see the captions option and you would like to enable captions, you may have to refresh the stream. Hey, Dremoto, welcome to the stream. Good to see you. Oh, and thank you for the sub, Wade KN. I'm not sure why my notifications aren't really, my on-screen notifications aren't working properly, but Wade KN 33, thank you so much for the sub. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your support. Oh, Matjor, thank you so much for the sub. Wow. I'm going to have to troubleshoot my notifications. I'm going to write a note for that right now because they have not been behaving properly, and I want everybody to get proper recognition, on-screen recognition. So for now, I'm going to have to thank you verbally, but Latjor, thank you so much. I'm literally writing a note right now. Sub note. Oh, there it goes. Okay, it just took like a hot minute. What the heck is going on? Notifications. I'm going to put sub notifications kind of broken. Kind of broken. And I'll look into that. Yeah, I'm not going to look into it right now. Thank you, Latjoy. All right. Hey, Debdi, welcome to the stream. How's it? I'm doing well. I hope you're doing well as well. And so, yeah, what we're doing here, if you're new to this series, this is an ongoing series, although if you are just tuning in for the first time, you're welcome to join us. We are going through the new React docs and learning about modern React. And so, by modern React, we mean, hooks and function-based React versus the older, class-based React. I find that hooks and React with modern hooks and functions is easier, at least for me, to pick up. And so, that's why we're doing modern React. But if you'd like to learn more about classic class-based React, I also have a series of streams on that as well. You can find those on my YouTube channel. Exclamation point YouTube in the chat if you'd like to learn about that as well. I'm going to put in chat. Yeah, and folks are sharing some additional React resources also. Absolutely feel free to check those out. There's no wrong way to learn React. We're using the official docs because, they're the official docs, but there's plenty of great resources out there. React is very popular. And as Red Sly Fox mentioned, they said lots of competition for JS jobs with all the layoffs at the moment. Kind of true, but it really depends. If you're, maybe a more junior developer, more entry level developer, there's really not as much competition as you might think. You hear about all these layoffs at Twitter, you hear about all these layoffs at Meta. Those are generally going to be, later career developers who are going to be asking for the big bucks, like really big bucks. They're used to $250,000 salaries and all that sort of thing. And so I think you're going to find there's maybe a lot of competition at that level, but every company's a tech company now, and most companies can afford to hire someone at a more reasonable salary, and they want to hire people. But learning React will help you. It just gives you another tool in your tool belt. It gives you another leg up. George says, I will take 60K to get a leg in. And yeah, it really depends on your location. It depends on, location, your country, all those sorts of things will determine your salary. But do know your worth, and don't undersell yourself, right? You are valuable. Your skills are valuable. Um, research good salaries for your area and for your country, and keep yourself in the competition. Don't sell yourself short because you are worth it. All right. So let's talk about state. Um, so what is state? So far, when we've been talking about React in the previous parts of this series, we've been focusing pretty heavily on individual components, right? Individual components, how we pass things into those components, how individual components react to user inputs, and that sort of thing. Thank you for the follow, Hungry Hungry Hippo. Great username, by the way. Fantastic. But now we're going to start to think about our user interface as a whole rather than just individual parts, right? We're going to think about it as a whole, a thing that works, that bundles individual components together to give the user a unified interface. Okay, and state is what's going to help us do that. So as our applications get larger, it helps to be more intentional about how our state is organized and how the data flows between components. So we're going to have, by default, our interface is probably going to have multiple components. And so we got to think about how do we pass data in between them. When a user clicks on a button in one component, how do we make sure that the other components are responding appropriately? Redundant or duplicate state is a common source of bugs. We're going to learn how to build state, structure it, how to maintain state logic, and how to share state between components. So first off, what is state in general? So React by its very nature is we're not going to modify our user interface, how it looks and feels. We're not going to modify that directly from code. What we're going to do is instead of writing commands like disable button, enable button, show success message, we're going to describe the UI that we want to see and describe each version that we want to see depending on the visual state of the component. So some examples of that might be initial state. So when the page first loads, how do we want it to look? And then another state might be typing state, when someone is actively typing in a box. How should everything look? Should things be grayed out while somebody is typing? Should certain buttons be enabled or disabled while somebody is typing? And then a success state. If whatever they've typed is successful, do we want them to see a message? Do we want to disable certain buttons? Do we want to change the color of the UI? I don't know, something. And then we trigger those state changes in response to user inputs. This is similar to how designers think about UI. And here's an example. We're going to get way more into this in the individual chapter, but I don't know the answer to. So here on the right they have a quiz. It says, in which city is there, does anybody know the answer to this? In which city is there a billboard that turns air into drinkable water? Help me out here. I honestly don't know the answer. I'm gonna say Houston. Oh, it was wrong. Well, it says Spain. Yeah, but Spain's a country. What's the city? Madrid? Seville? Nope. Does anybody know? Somebody Google it for me. Hey, Hang, welcome to the stream. What, are you just guessing all the cities in Spain? Bilbao. Okay, I don't know the right answer, but if somebody does come up with it, I'll type in it and y'all can guess. Barcelona? I don't, and to be clear, I don't know that it's in Spain. LatJor just said that. Oh, Lima! Whoa! Hawaii's coming in. Nice. With the right answer. So it was Lima. But did you notice that every time we typed something into the box, made entries, that kind of thing? Let's look at this again really quickly. So first off, pay attention to how the window looks when we first initialize it, right? We have an empty box here. We have a submit button that's grayed out. We can't click it. But then as soon as I start typing, the submit button becomes available, right? I can type it. So what we just saw there was a state change. As soon as I started typing, we saw a flip in the way the user interface looks, and that was a state change. And the state change when I get the answer right is obvious. It's changes a lot, right? That was obviously a state change. But then there's also a state change if I get it wrong, right? It adds this text down here telling me that I'm wrong. And it makes the button available again so I can change my answer. And so all of these are examples of state changes. And so we're going to learn how to make state and what state looks like in just a minute. But I do just want to look really quickly and show you how the state in this particular example is being controlled. So here we have 3 state variables. On the left here, the first one is answer, the second one is error, and the third one is status. And we can see right here an example of how that status state is being utilized when the status is successful. So if the person gets the answer right, that means that the status state is now set to success. That was a lot of S words. If the status state is set to success, then we simply return an H1 with that's right. And that flips that state, which then changes how the user interface looks entirely. And we return simply an H1 header with the words that's right. And this example is pretty complicated to start out with, so we're not going to dig into this particular example, but I just want to kind of give an example of what state is used for, some examples of state, and then a very simple example of how it's implemented. Yes, lots of S's, Mattel. That was really hard to say. Crypto says, I love React. Yeah. Okay. So now let's go ahead and dive into this topic. All right, let's talk about reacting to input with state. So React provides a declarative way to manipulate the UI. Instead of manipulating individual pieces of the UI directly, you describe each of the different states that your component can be in, and you switch between them in response to user input. This is similar to how designers think about the UI. And so that's kind of different than how we normally think about building our user interfaces, right? Normally we tend to think about things in terms of like individual buttons or individual forms, or maybe individual pieces of text. And if you're writing in JavaScript, something changes, you would control each individual button, each individual line of text to respond to certain other things happening. And as your app becomes more complex, if you have a lot of that responsive type stuff, it can get pretty complicated pretty fast. And what's useful about React is that you can, instead of controlling each little piece individually, you can sort of create almost like blueprints for the entire user interface at a time, and then just flip between those when something changes based on the user input. So you can, instead of controlling little bitty pieces, you're just controlling the whole UI at once or whole components at once. Oh, MK Beast, thank you so much for the sub. Wow. Thank you, MKE. I really appreciate it. Apologies, my on screen notifications aren't working, but believe me, I do see you and I appreciate it. Thank you so much. So now let's talk about some of those things I just touched on. So how declarative UI compares to imperative. So what do those words mean, and what are we talking about when we say that they're different? When we design UI interactions, we probably think about how the UI changes in response to user actions. So in a form where the user submits an answer, when you type something into the form, the submit button becomes enabled. Makes sense. When you press submit, both the form and the button become disabled and a spinner appears. If the network request succeeds, the form gets hidden and you see a thank you message. And if the network request fails, an error message appears and the form becomes enabled again. In imperative programming, the above corresponds directly to how you implement interaction. You have to write the exact instructions to manipulate the UI depending on what just happened. So it's like if you were in a car with somebody, if you were in a car with somebody and they don't know where to go, but you're the backseat driver or passenger seat driver, you're riding shotgun, and you are telling them every individual turn. So they don't know where you want to go. They just follow your commands. And if you get the directions wrong, you end up in the wrong place. So you're saying turn left, turn right, go right by the greenhouse, go left by the I don't know, by the tree. And it's very possible and very easy to get that wrong. It's called imperative because you have to command each individual element from the spinner to the button, telling the computer how to update the UI. And that's kind of what we're used to doing, right? And so Awais, that's what imperative means. You're commanding, you're controlling and commanding each individual element. Yeah. Zuzu says, I see a lot of similarities between React and Blazor. Welcome to the stream, by the way. Yeah, I haven't used Blazor, but if anybody else has, feel free to share your thoughts on that too. Because yeah, React is similar to several other options. React is, I think, is probably the most popular, but there's other frameworks out here that do that have a similar sort of declarative style. So here's an example of, we looked at that previous quiz, that previous simple question and answer quiz type deal, and we talked about some of the things it was doing, right? We talked about some of the ways that the UI was responding to me interacting with it. And if you wanted to do that in basically vanilla JavaScript, this is how you might do it. And we're not going to go in super in depth with this, but I can zoom in a little here. We're not going to go super in depth with this, but as we scroll through it, we can see that we're trying to control each individual element of this single component, right? So we have to um, disable the text area, disable the button. So when the form is submitted, right, we're disabling text area, we're disabling button, we're showing a message, we're hiding errors. Then we're doing a try catch, and we're hiding and showing more things. Um, when somebody starts typing, well, before they start typing, we have to make sure the button is disabled, right? The submit button is disabled. And then as soon as they start typing, we have to enable it. And so each of those we have to do manually. And then, we have to control hide, we have to control show, enable, disable, um, how we submit the form, doing checking to make sure the answer is right, putting together every individual event listener here. You can tell it's pretty nasty, right? It kind of sucks. It looks gross. That doesn't mean it's bad, right? You could do it this way, and we have done things like this before, right? To manually control behavior of individual elements. That's something that I think many of us have probably done with vanilla JavaScript, figuring out how to do that. Maybe not this complex, but something similar. However, React is going to make that much easier on us by taking us out of that granular, fiddling with every individual element, and taking us up to where we're basically just building out blueprints for how we want our UI to look at any given point. So manipulating the UI imperatively works well for isolated examples, but it gets exponentially more difficult to manage in more complex systems. So imagine if we had more than one form on the page, right? We needed all of this. We needed all of this for a single simple form with one input box and one button. That would be terrible if we had, 7 different forms on the page. Adding a new UI element or a new interaction would require carefully checking all existing code to make sure that you haven't introduced a bug. For example, maybe you forget to show or hide one button or one text element. And that's why React exists. In React, you don't directly manipulate the UI, so you don't enable, disable, show, or hide components directly. Instead, you simply declare what you want to show, and React figures out how to update the UI for you. So you simply say, hey, React, I want this, please. And React then figures out how to do that. So it's more of like versus being the backseat driver for, your best friend, Larry, who's trying to, take you to your brother's house. It's more of like getting into a taxi and telling the driver where you want to go instead of telling them exactly where to turn. The taxi driver is going to know the best way. You just got to sit back and let them get there. It's the driver's job to get you there, and they might even know some shortcuts that you haven't considered. So here's how it might look if with React in the driver's seat. These little cartoons are so cute. I love in this one up here. I really like how JavaScript is like sweating. That's just a great little detail. I love that. It's cute. So instead of thinking about the UI imperatively, we want to think about it declaratively. Um, so let's think about now how we can take that imperative example that was above and implement the UI in React below. Oh, Sirius, thank you so much for the Prime sub. I really appreciate it. Wow, thank you. And yeah, the great thing about Prime subs is that they don't cost you, the viewer, they don't cost you anything at all. They are free to you. If you are an Amazon Prime subscriber, you should absolutely be using your Prime sub before you spend any of your own money. And you don't have to use it on me. Just pick your favorite streamer and use your Prime sub on them because it benefits the streamer without costing you anything at all. So Prime subs are great. All they do is cost Jeff Bezos money, which I think we can all agree is a good thing. All right, so how do we implement a UI in React instead of imperatively like we would with vanilla JavaScript? So the first thing we do is we identify the component's different visual states. So if we have a component, what are the possible configurations of that component that we could potentially have? How is it going to look when it's first initialized? How is it going to look when somebody's typing? How is it going to look when somebody clicks a button? We don't need to think about how we get there. We just need to think about how it should look when we do get there. Then we determine what triggers those state changes. Is it typing? Is it a button click? Is it, I don't know, a toggle switch? What might trigger that change? And then we represent the state in memory using use state, which we'll talk about in a minute. We remove any non-essential state variables to keep things decluttered and prevent conflicts of state. And then we connect our event handlers to set the state. So we talked about event handlers 2 weeks ago now in our previous React stream. So does anybody remember? Can anybody give me an example of what an event handler? Well, give me an example of what an event might be. What's an example of an event? When we talk about event handlers, they're things that handle events, right? So what's an example of an event? Yeah, lots of great examples there. So we've got clicks, right? We've got clicks, we've got hovers, we've got submits, we've got changes. Yeah, we've got mouse enter. Ooh, that's a good one. Uncommon. Yeah, submitting a form. Exactly. Yeah, those are all great examples. Those are examples of events which we would then use. So like a click is an event, which we would then use an event handler such as onClick to handle that event, and then potentially that event might trigger a state change, right? If they've clicked a certain button, that might trigger a difference in the UI, which would be caused by a state change. So this is just hooking up those event handlers to the missing piece, which is state. Yeah, exactly. Great examples. Great examples. Okay, I'm going to hydrate real quick. And Latjor points out something really good up above there. Um, they say prime subs give all your sub value to the streamer instead of just a percentage. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I've forgotten about that. Thank you, Latjor. It because normally we get 50% of each sub, the rest of it goes to Twitch. But yeah, if you use it on your favorite streamer, they get all the money, so that's nice too. Again, not saying to subscribe to me, but any streamer, if you want to give them the full value of your sub, use a Prime sub. Okay, so let's break down each of these steps individually a little bit more. So identify your components' different visual states. In computer science, which I do not have a background in, so I don't know what this is, but in computer science, you may hear about a state machine being in one of several states. So I'm curious, anybody with a computer science background, is that something you learned about? If anybody actually took computer science classes in college or whatever, um, have y'all heard of state machines? It's okay if none of us have heard of it. It doesn't really matter in this context, but Latdro says, I've heard of it. Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'm just curious if that was like a thing. Latdro says, but not in comp sci. Okay. Okay. But anyway, we're definitely gonna explain what it is here. It's not something, I'm not saying you should have heard of it already, but I was just curious because I hadn't heard of it. So if you work with a designer, you may have seen mock-ups for different visual states, right? If you work with a designer or if you've done your own work in Figma, you might be mapping out certain configurations based on what the user has done. You might have several variations on a particular page. React stands at the intersection of design and computer science, so both of those ideas are sources of inspiration. First, you need to visualize all the different states of the UI that the user might see. So in our example above, we have empty. Our first state is empty. That's when the page first loads, the box is empty, the form has a disabled submit button. That's how we want it to look, right? When somebody is typing, the form has an enabled submit button. When somebody is submitting, the form is completely disabled. They should not be allowed to interact with the form while it's being submitted, and there should be a spinner that shows up. And then if the form submission is successful, we have a success state. A thank you message is shown, and the form should not be shown. And then finally, if the form submission is not successful, we should also have an error state, which will display to the user that, hey, something has gone wrong, we have an error message, and the form should be modifiable. OA says it means the Turing states. I don't know. If you want, you can click this link right here to learn more about state machines. Um, it's, this would be, it's, if you want to dive into the concept of state machines, you certainly can. But yeah, I'm not quite sure what I didn't dive into this, so I'm not sure what it means. In either way, it's, we're going to learn about how React identifies state versus the traditional concept. So, just like a designer, you'll want to mock up or create mocks for the different states before you add logic. For example, here is a mock for just the visual part of the form. This mock is controlled by a prop called status with a default value of empty. So let's see what they've done here. This is similar to the example we looked at before, looking at a city. And they built just a very simple mock-up, right? This is not a fully functional component. It's just a mock-up to display kind of what we want to see. And we have a sort of a manual control of status here. So we have a variable called status, and that variable then directly controls whether the that's right option is shown or not. So we could call the prop anything we like. The naming is not important. We could edit status to empty or success to manually trigger that success message. And what mocking does is it lets us quickly iterate on the UI before you wire up any logic. So here is a more fleshed out prototype, still controlled by the status prop. So we have our status prop. And now we can see that status is controlling some more things. So it's controlling whether we can display the success message. It's identifying whether or not the text area should be enabled or disabled. It's controlling whether or not the button would be enabled or disabled. And it's saying whether or not we throw an error. So let's just, let's see what happens if I change this to error. There we go. So here, I was able to manually trigger the wrong answer condition, right? All this is manual. This has nothing to do with what I put in the box or do, right? If I submit this form, right? Even if I give the right answer, we already know the right answer. Even if I give the right answer, it's still going to show the wrong answer condition because I have manually set this status. So this is not truly reacting or responding to me. It's still a mock-up that's only responding to what I manually put in here. So what we're going to do now, what we're going to do next is wire up so that it's actually really responding to user inputs. Latjoy, thank you so much for that explanation about Turing states. As someone without a any kind of computer science background, I do appreciate learning about these things. Those are things I missed out on, and so I love the opportunity to learn about them now. So thank you for that. Much appreciated. All right, we're gonna skip, and next up there is a next up there is a deep dive, but we're gonna skip that for now. I don't want things to get too deep too quickly, so we'll come back to that later. But we've figured out what our different visual states for our component should be, right? We've identified them, and we've done a mock-up that kind of can manually trigger those visual states on and off, right? We have our, as a reminder, we have 5 states right now: empty, typing, submitting, success, and error. Okay, so we've identified the states. So now let's determine how those, what should trigger those state changes, right? Because in our mockup, we could make the state change, but we had to do it manually. We didn't have anything that automatically triggered those state changes. So we can trigger updates in response to 2 kinds of inputs. The first one is obvious, right? Human inputs. We can click a button, type a field. You all gave some great examples of events that could trigger a state change before. But the other one is also computer inputs, like a network response arriving, timeouts, images loading, that sort of thing. For example, whether or not a form is able to submit successfully. So whether we have a successful submission or we get an error back um, from our API, those are examples of computer inputs that could trigger a different state. And in either case, we need to set state variables to update the UI. So we'll learn more about what those are in just a second. So for the form we're developing, you need to change state in response to a few different inputs. We might change the text input. We might type into our form. And that's an example of a human input, right? We can switch it from empty state to typing state while somebody's typing. We could click the submit button. That's another human input. We could get a successful network response, like we just said, that's a computer input. That would switch it to the success state. We could get a failed network response, and that would switch it to an error state with the matching error message. So those are all of our state triggers. And human inputs often do require event handlers, which we talked about before, right? So to help visualize the flow between states, you can draw each state on paper as a labeled circle and each change between two states as an arrow, sorry. You can sketch out many flows this way and sort out bugs long before implementation. Latdor says async. Where did you see async? Sorry. I don't think, did I mention async? Sorry, I'm not quite following. Oh, network request. Yeah. As an example of state. Yeah. So if we had an async function that was storing something in a database, right? If we had an async function that was storing something in a database or fetching something from a database, as you say, yeah, the response that we get back from the database could be an example of something that could trigger a state change, or maybe what we retrieve from the database. So the actual contents of that retrieval, whether it's empty or whether we actually get something back, that could trigger a state change. Yeah, there's all sorts of things in there that are examples of potential state triggers. And whether or not we do trigger a state change really depends on what we're trying to display, right? What we're trying to tell the user or show the user at a given point. And so here's an example of, for our form, here's an example of how that state might flow. Hey, Ahmed, good to see you. So our form starts out empty, right? So we start out with our empty state. That's our initial state. Initial state is empty. And then once somebody starts typing, we go into the typing state. And then they're done typing. They hit submit. We go into our submitting state. And then we might go into one of two other states, depending on the response we get back from the network, right? If we get an error, then we'll go into our error state. If we get a success message, then we'll go into our success state. So so now we know what our states should be, what states we need, right? We know what states we need. We know conceptually how we want those states to be triggered, like what should trigger each state and kind of the order of the way they flow. And so the next step then is, how do we represent that state in memory? So in code, how do we actually encode all of these ideas that we've talked about so far, right? We can visualize it conceptually, but how do we actually encode it? And this is the big guns right here. This is super important. We represent the state in memory with something called use state. Use state is an example of a hook, and it's how we're actually going to encode what we've conceptualized as our states. So we'll need to represent the visual states of your component in memory with use state. Simplicity is key. Each piece of state is a moving piece, and you want as few moving pieces as possible. More complexity leads to more bugs. Now, we're going to take a brief time out here because I don't feel like this particular page talks about use state very well, and it's extremely important. So we're going to use the fact that this is a hyperlink, which takes us to the actual documentation for use state, and we're going to take a brief detour into the other documentation and read a little bit more about what use state is, how it looks, and what it's for. Okay, and then we'll talk about how we actually use it, because the documentation goes right into how you can start using it, and we don't even know what use state is. Like, what the frick is this? It's a word. So let's look at it a little bit more. So I'm going to click this link. I've already done that, and this takes us to the actual documentation page for use state. All right, quick hydrate. So what is use state? Use state is a React hook that lets us add a state variable to your component. So it's just a way that we can both store and update a particular state. Okay, that's all it is. And this is its structure. We declare it just like we would a variable. And then we actually store our state here in a state variable, which we can name whatever we want. And we can set it here. And then we simply declare it like this, use state with the initial state inside the parentheses. Okay, so this is just general structure. We're going to see it over and over again. We have state, set state, and then use state, where we set our initial, how we want that state to look initially. And we're going to see more examples of this. Okay, so how do we do this? We call use state at the top level of our component to declare a state variable. So the first thing we do is we import use state. And then inside of our component, the first thing we do before anything else is we declare our individual states. And we talked about it before. So some of the states in the example we've looked at so far, some of the examples some of the states in the example we've looked at so far are empty, typing, error, submitting, all those things, all those states that we might want to use in our component. We simply declare them like so. Okay, so for something like empty, I might say empty, set empty, and then whatever that initial value of that state should be. So when I first load the form, if empty is referring to the look of the form of that text input box, when I first load the page, what do you think the initial state of that should be? What should the initial state of my text box be when I first refresh the page or load the page? What should that initial state be of any text box, really, when we load a form? And Rex Rocker says, "Is this 100 devs beginner friendly?" It helps if you've seen the previous entries in our series, but you're welcome to hang out and sort of absorb some information if you want. Yeah, it could be probably an empty string, right? It's probably just going to be, empty quotes. That's our initial state. And then as we do stuff in that text box, right? As we do stuff in that text box, we're going to update that state repeatedly to keep track of what we're typing in the text box. Okay? So first off, our initial state, which is stored in our state variable, is going to be, an empty string. And then we can call set state, we can call that set state multiple times as we're typing to repeatedly update what's stored in our state variable. Okay, thank you for the follow, Frederico. Much appreciated. And in this particular example here, the initial state of age is 28. And then if we wanted to update that, we would simply call set age and set it to 29, in which case the value of age would then be 29. Okay, so you can see how these work together, right? Set age updates whatever is stored in age, but the initial value is always declared here. And we'll see plenty of examples of this, but we're gonna get some repetition here as far as how we use these and how they work. The convention is to name state variables like something, comma, set something. And when we do that, we use array destructuring, right? So we've talked about destructuring before, but what that's allowing us to do is really just declare both of these at once using array destructuring, and then we can reference them later. Rex says, yeah, for some reason, I thought this series started with JS fundamentals. Oh, it does. It does. It does. We are just, if you want to see the actual 100 Devs Discord, Rex, if you want to start from the beginning, I've just triggered some links for you there in chat. So the Discord link is the third one there, leonnoel.com/Discord. Join the Discord and check out, there's plenty of resources there for people who are just starting out. No, that's totally fine, Rex. Welcome to 100 Devs. We're just covering more advanced topics, outside of the actual class, like cohort classes. But you can find all of the original videos for all of the beginner from 0 to hero classes on the Discord, as well as lots of friendly people and folks that are going to have a lot of additional resources for you. Rex, after you join the Discord, make sure that you've read all the rules, you've checked all the boxes, and then go to the Catch Up Crew channel. Okay? Catch Up Crew is where folks hang out who are just starting out. You'll find a lot of group of supportive people there who are kind of just starting out like you, and you can all learn together. And so, yeah, good luck on your journey, Rex. And then Ahmed says, what's the best time to learn React? If I'm on class 25, I know there'll be React classes at the end. So actually in the core 100 devs cohort, unfortunately, there are not React classes. That's why we're covering it here. Well, I mean, I guess there's a little bit of an introduction, but not a lot. So we're covering it deeper here. Yeah, no worries, Brack. Feel free to stick around too. You can be on the Discord and here at the same time. It's all good. Yeah, Ahmed, I would say that, focus on the core concepts, right? Make sure that you have a really good understanding of JavaScript. And then once you feel like you've got the fundamentals of JavaScript down, feel free to pivot to React. I don't know your schedule. I don't know what kind of time you have, but do make JavaScript your priority, your main priority. Build stuff first, right? Get to the point where you're able to build projects and build up your portfolio. Then you can start branching out. Okay, so how we set our state initially is always going to have the same structure, right? Const, and then our state variable, our set state variable, and then our initial value. Okay, so the parameters of this are initial state, which is what we want our state to be initially, right? It can be a value of any type, but there's a special behavior for functions. This argument is ignored after the initial render. And if you pass a function as initial state, it will be treated as an initializer function, and it should be pure, no arguments, and should return a value of any type. React will call your initializer function when initializing the component, and then store its return value as the initial state. We don't really have to worry about that for now. We're not going to talk about functions so much, but just know that the parameters, what we're passing in here, is just whatever value we want our state to be at the beginning, whether that's maybe an empty box, an initial value for age, such as 28, a default value for a name, something like that. And then what we get back is just whatever the current state is. So if we pass an initial state into, say, like a text box, we pass that initial state as an empty string, then what we get back is an empty text box, right? If we passed in a value of, I don't know, Larry into that initial state for a text box, then we would get a text box with the word Larry in it. And then if we want to change that value, we use the set function, which allows us to update the state to a different value and triggers a re-render. Okay, and we're going to ignore caveats for now. We'll talk more about those later. But what the set function does then is allows us to update the state to a different value and trigger a re-render. You can pass the next state directly or a function that calculates it from the previous state. So here we can see an example of that. We've set our state as name and set name, right? With an initial value of Edward. So whatever we're passing this into, let's say it's a text box, that text box is going to say Edward. But then once somebody, let's say it's a button actually. So we have a button that says Edward. And when the page loads, that button is going to say Edward because this is our initial value. Now, as soon as somebody clicks that button, we're going to call our set name function and update that to say Taylor. Then the component will re-render. And the next time it re-renders, that button will now say Taylor. The other thing we're doing here is we're also setting age as well. So what we're doing when we're calling set name is we're passing in whatever the state should be next. This is the value that we want the state to be. It can be a value of any type, but there's a special behavior for functions. Okay, we're going to ignore the function behavior for now. I'm not trying to get into the weeds here. And we'll talk about caveats as well. Okay, so let's talk about usage. So we've kind of talked about this a little bit already, but I want to go over it again. And this has color coding, and it's very nice. Larry was Edward all along. Sometimes you just got to find yourself, right? Oh, Third Decade says, can you increase screen size? I can by 1 notch. Yeah, I think that's about as big as I can make it without causing display issues. But hopefully that's a little bit better. Okay, so how do we add state to a component? Well, we can call use state at the top level of our component to declare one or more state variables. And so whenever we want to use state, we simply import it like we've done before with other things, right? We've imported previously when we were looking at like parent and child components, right? We would import components from another file. We could reference things that are in another file in another location, and we would import them just like this. So if we want to use state, we import it just like we did with other components before. And once we've imported it, we can start declaring our states. And again, once again, the current state, which is this blue value here, is the current state. I mean, it's a variable that holds whatever the current state is, right? And it's initially set to whatever initial state we provide. So the purple right here. So in this case, when the page loads, when this component loads for the first time, age is set to 42. And when the component loads for the first time, the name value is then set to Taylor. Now the set function lets us change it to any other value in response to that interaction. To update what's on the screen, we call the set function with some next state. So here on click, we set our name to Robin. And so the next time that component renders, the value of the name state is going to be Robin instead of Taylor. So I know I'm kind of repeating this a lot, but this is really fundamental and really important to understand. Okay? Larry is just trying to live their best life. Too late now. It's now Taylor. Hey, look, they're just doing some self-exploration here. However they identify, I support them, okay? Let's all support them. Running away from the police? Maybe, I don't know. Frederico says, will you be covering use effect in the future? Yes, we will. But right now we're gently introducing the concept of state altogether. We haven't talked about it before, so we're going to spend a great deal of time on just state, and then we'll look into some of the other hooks as well. Could be running from the state police, but very nice. I like it a lot. Oh, and Jupiter, thank you for the follow. Latjor says, so use state has to come with a way to set it. Yes, and so you're generally going to see whenever you declare a state variable, you're going to want a way to change that state. That's kind of the point, right? Is that you're going to want a way to respond to things that are happening and change that state, right? I mean, the reason that you would have a state in the first place, pretty much the reason you would have state in the first place is because it's something that could potentially change, that you want to be able to control and respond and react to other things that are happening on the screen or from a from the network side. Now, one important thing to remember is that calling set does not change the current state in the code that's already executing. So in the same case as above, if we added a console log to this and we said set name Robin, right? It was Taylor, right? They were Taylor. And then we set their name to Robin. If we were to console log name while this function is still being executed, while this component is still being executed, it would still log as Taylor. However, as soon as this component finishes executing, the update is complete, the component re-renders, and then if we were to console log outside of this, it would log as Robin. So that's just a pitfall that might, trip you up if you're not careful. It only affects what use state will return starting from the next time the component renders. And there's some examples down here. I think we'll just look at this first one and then we'll go back to the main documents. Here's an example, a very simple application of state. So we're importing use state from React, right? First step, we import use state. That's easy to forget. And now we have a simple counter component that every time you press it, it counts up by 1, right? Very easy. So, quick pop quiz. What are we doing here? What is this line doing? And what effect do you think that's going to have on the UI? Pop quiz. Oh, panic. Yeah, so we're setting the initial state of our count. We're setting the initial state of count to 0, right? Yep. And what effect does this actually have on the UI? Can you spot it? Do you see where we are applying this state that we just initialized? Right? Because you all are exactly right. We're setting an initial state to 0. Now, do you see where specifically in the code down below, do you see where that's being used? What line is it on? Do you see it? Yeah, exactly. So it's being used in 2 places, but from a UI perspective, with the first time this page loads, right? If I were to reset this, that 0 is right here on render, right? First time this renders, it's being used in the UI right here. That is where we pull in this state variable, which is set to 0, right? We take this state variable of count and we drop it into the UI right there. Now, each time I click this, it's calling this handle click function. We can see, and I know that, right? I know that because we have this right here, which is called a what? What is that called? In general, what's the word for this? Not quite a listener. A. What is it? What is it called? What's the vocab word for this? You're gonna need to know what these things are called. We talked about them earlier, in a general sense. Yeah, it's an event handler. It's an so this part that I have highlighted right here. Yeah, exactly. It is an event handler. This is a very 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 specific thing because what it does is it's handling a particular kind of event. And we already talked about types of events before, right? There's lots of different types of events. We could have clicks, we could have scrolls, we could have hovers, we could have typing. But in this case, this event handler is specifically for clicks, right? Click. That causes that event handler to fire because that event handler is attached to the button. On click, do something. And in this case, on click, we call this handle click function. And when we do that, this handle click function calls set count, which updates the counter. Okay? The counter gets updated by 1, then the component re-renders, and at this point, our count variable, so is we've clicked, let's say I've reset this. I click it once, right? Handle click is called, which then calls set count, increments the count by 1, the component re-renders. Now our state value of count is already set to 1, so the component re-renders with you pressed me 1 times. Okay, so each time I'm clicking this, it's a whole series of actions that's happening, right? Latro says, so it is like a for loop for state of variables. Um, it's a series of events, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a loop, right? Because we are only triggering it, it only fires with a specific interaction, right? It's not like it keeps firing until we reach a count of 10 or something like that, right? It only fires when a specific interaction occurs, right? It's purely controlled by this event handler. Yeah. Oh, thank you for the hydrate, Kosova. Sorry, I didn't see that right away. Mm. Um, Latner says, so function name of handle collect can be any name. Yep. So really, these event handlers can do a variety of things, but most of the time you're probably going to be calling a function. Whoops. Woo. There we go. You're probably going to be calling a function which is going to do something with your state, or potentially maybe cause another component to be displayed. But probably an event handler is going to call a function which is going to do something to your state. But if you'd like to learn more about event handlers specifically, um, in the previous in the documentation in the previous section, which we're going to go back to in a minute, there's a lot of discussion about event handlers and how to apply them. Jupiter says, want to just clarify real quick. I think you said on your Twitter, this is going to be recorded on YouTube. Yes, that's correct. If you want to link to my YouTube channel, do !YouTube in chat. And then that will give you a link to my YouTube channel. And I don't move things to YouTube right away. Usually after a couple weeks, I'll move like a batch of streams to YouTube, but they are available on Twitch. My streams are recorded, so they are available on Twitch for 60 days. And then they expire. I can't do anything about that. It's automatic. They expire, they disappear, but they will be on YouTube before that time. So you're never going to lose the ability to view them. You might just have to go from Twitch to YouTube if something is old enough. Yeah. NASA mug. Yeah. Yeah. I used to work for a company that printed various designs on like home goods, and so I got a bunch of free stuff. You can see this mug is pretty faded. It was a misprint, so I think it still looks cool. So I used to get a lot of slightly damaged or slightly misprinted housewares. I still have a bunch of them too. Boone Gonzalez, thank you for the sub. Wow, thank you so much, Boone. I really appreciate it. Gosh, thank you so much, Boone. Really appreciate your support. And Bob says a state is basically the current value of a variable. Well, it's the current value of the state variable that we declare, right? So it's not any variable. Not all variables are state, right? Because state is specifically a controller for the state of our UI, right? It has a very specific purpose. These variables have a very specific purpose. They control how our UI appears. And also our state is paired with a setter, right? We have the variable itself that stores the value, and then we have the actual function that is specifically made to update that value or change that value. Okay, so it's a pair. They work together. The variable itself, in this place, count, and then the function that updates count. Can't beat free, absolutely. Tried printing designs on the sides of house cats, but it all went horribly wrong. We printed on a lot of stuff. I still have a crock pot that we printed on. That was pretty cool. Free crock pot. And Dan says you can think of state as data that changes with time. Yeah, and what causes that data to change could be a user interaction. It could be time itself. It could be a network change. Something coming from the server. Absolutely. Okay, so I really like this little example. I think it's a great little encapsulation of several of the things that we've talked about already, right? So not just state, but also event handlers, functions that are called by event handlers, and then how the state value, the state variable, and then the set function work together to update that state. Can we do cat set cat? Yeah. Yeah, you could change these names to be whatever makes sense for the application. Oh, and I see your poll there, third decade. I'll set that up over the break. We're about ready to take a break. Yes, exactly, Bob. Yep. It has to be set in a very specific way, right? That's how React knows that it's a state variable, that this set function is meant to update it. And it's going to work. This is how we specifically say this is controlling our state. Yes, these are hooks. I think it says, let's see, I thought that was, yeah. So use state is a hook that simply allows us to add the state variable to our component. Yep. Okay, so I hope that makes sense as a brief sort of primer on the elements of what we do when we declare state, what each of these things are for, right? Why we do it this way, and some of the interactions that happen here. Now, next, what we're going to do after the break is we're going to go back to the main docs, and we're going to kind of pick up where we left off. I felt like this was necessary to do, to say like, okay, wait, but what are all these things? Because the main documentation does not talk about this at all, which I think is a huge oversight. And so, or at least it doesn't talk about it well. And so we're gonna go back to the main docs with a lot better understanding, and we're gonna talk about how to then apply this stuff, right? Yeah. And Dan makes a good distinction there. So use state is the hook, and then set set here, this right here, this is the function that updates that state, right? So we say, all right, I'm going to import use state, our hook, and then we declare these items here, the first of which is our state variable, the second of which is the function that updates the state, and then the initial value of the state itself. Okay, so it is break time. We're going to take a break, and then when we come back, we're going to go back to the main docs and then talk more about, okay, we understand what these are, what all these items are now. How do we use them? And how do we use them in a real example, which is the example we looked at before, which is that form where we could, type something, click the button, get an error message, or get a success message, right? That was our very simple little progression that we had. So now we're going to actually figure out how to encode that using basically this format right here. How do we encode that? And then how do we reference that state in our code? All right. So 5-minute timer. And then when we come back, let's figure out some practical applications. Best part. I don't know about you, but that's what I like is, all right, you can tell me all this vocab as much as you want, but how do I actually use it? So that's what we're going to do next. And then I'm also going to set up the poll that Third Decade requested. So be sure to vote on that when you come back. Get up and stretch. Don't just sit there. Go do something for a sec, get a glass of water, and then come on back. Okay, folks, we got about a minute left in the break, so come on back. If you have just been sitting there this entire time, get up and stretch right now and get yourself a glass of water or your favorite beverage. As long as you hydrate, I don't really care. And also do note that the poll has been initialized, and you'll see it at the top of the chat window. So Third Decade requested the poll. Please do participate. I'm curious about the answer as well. There's a few hard-coded options, and then if you want something other than what's listed, do put it in chat, and I'll see those as well. Coconut water. Well, we got a lot of wide variety here. Coffee, coconut water. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the timer here. What's my hair doing? Okay. Woo! Sorry about that. Why is it going off? That was weird. I paused the timer, but it still went off. I don't understand. Glad that I imagine that probably woke some folks up. Sorry about that if you're watching this on YouTube. Uh, my bad. I love the variety of chosen beverages, though. Coffee, coconut water, coffee, mate. Mommy says they're the only Uruguayan that doesn't drink mate. Oh, that's funny. But yeah, the poll is going for the next 10 minutes, so please do vote. If you are watching this on YouTube at some point in the distant future, once you've finished, dialing into the matrix, please do leave your preferred answer in the comments, and I'll see those as well. Time cannot be stopped. Wow, Akechi, that was really deep. Time cannot be stopped. Yeah, dang. Having me question my own mortality on a weekend. That's rough, man. Yeah, we got some good suggestions here. Yeah, please vote in the poll or if you have another answer that's not listed, please put it in chat or in the YouTube comments. All right, so we've talked about state and how we declare it, and then a brief example of how it can be used. So, one more time, first thing we need to do is import use state from React, pull in our hook, and then we declare our state as a const, and then with the actual state variable, followed immediately by the function that we would use to update that state. And then finally, we need to set whatever the initial value of that state should be the first time the component is rendered. So initial value, and then we store that in our state variable, and then we call our set function to update that specific state. Okay, so let's go back to the main docs now. And as a reminder, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to build a very simple component with a form that will allow us to make entries into, it will allow us to make entries into a text box and then click a submit button. And there's multiple states that are involved with that. So our first state here is going to be when the form is initially rendered. It's going to have an empty state. When somebody's typing, we have a typing state. Press submit, we have a submitting state. And then depending on whether or not the form submits successfully, we might have one of two states, either an error or a success. Okay. Hey, little robot, how's it going? Good to see you. That's an adorable little emote there. Very cute. Okay. Tamkin Code says other obtaining peace of mind in 2023. I don't know if I can help with that. Ladjor says maybe post the poll in YouTube community tab. Yeah, maybe so. I haven't really done much with my YouTube community. I do read the comments, but yeah, I have to see what my options are there. Oh, and GPT-4 plugins. That's a good idea as well. Oh, we got a hydrate as well. Thank you for that, Salih. Thank you. Okay, so we've defined our state. We've learned how to declare state and how to reference it. So let's go on to step 3. We're going to represent our state in memory with use state. So in reference to the graphic above, we're going to kind of start first by building out our, declaring each of the states that we think we're going to need in order to make this form function. So we're going to start with the state that absolutely must be there. So for example, if we're going to need to store the answer for the input and an error to store an error. So in our input, box, when we submit it, we're going to need to store the actual answer that the person provided. And then if we get an error, then we're going to need to store that as well. So um, by default, we can see that the initial value of answer is an empty string, which makes sense, right? When everything loads in, we don't want to, we want the user to provide the answer. So we're going to initialize this answer state with a value of empty string. And then for the error, by default, there should be no error at all, right? Error should not exist because we have just initialized this. We haven't tried to submit anything yet. So therefore, we don't have an error. So therefore, the initial state of our error state is going to be null. Now, this might change if we do get an error. We could update this to the actual error value, but by default, it is going to be null. Okay, so we can see here how we can sort of have these initial values be whatever best reflects the proper initial state, right? Okay, so these are our defaults, the basic ones. And now we want to go ahead and set up the rest of them as well. So we're also going to need a state variable representing which one of the visual states that you want to display. So these are our default states that we absolutely have to have. And then we're going to follow that with our various UI configurations that we talked about before in that diagram up above. There's usually more than a single way to represent this in memory, so we're going to need to experiment with it. If you struggle to think of the best way immediately, start by adding enough states that you're definitely sure that all the possible visual configurations are covered. Okay, and that's kind of what we've done here. So when the form first loads in, we have our empty. We're going to have, and these are all, notice these are all Booleans, and so that's a little bit different than what we saw up here. But yeah, this is valid. We can have Boolean values. We can have empty strings. We can have nulls. We can have functions. We can have all sorts of things. This initial value can be set to whatever makes the most sense. Now, the reason we are setting these to Booleans here, or the reason they are, is that these booleans are going to trigger whether like certain things are true or not. So for example, whether a button is enabled, um, whether something is in a box, whether some text is visible, that kind of thing. We can very easily use these booleans to turn things on and off. So in this case, is empty is going to default to true. Is typing is going to default to false. Now, just looking at the two of these, this makes sense, right? Because when the form first loads, it's going to be empty. Makes sense. And then when the form first loads, you're not going to be typing in it. So the initial value is going to be false, right? And same for submitting, right? When the form first loads, you're not submitting it. It just loaded. It's going to wait for the person to click submit. And then when they do, this state will flip to true. Okay? And the final two also need to be set to false because we have not submitted the form yet, so we do not have a response, and therefore by default both of these should be false. Okay, so a lot of folks want to see React projects. Good to know. But then there are also some wonderful suggestions in chat as well, so I'll read back through those and make sure I've captured those also. Dan can code, yeah. I see that you redeemed a word ban. I'm afraid I'm not going to honor that one just because I really want this to be clear, but that is pretty hilarious. So I do appreciate the humor. Feel free to, I'll give you a freebie for another time if you want to, maybe not this time, but another time if you want to have a free word ban, you can. Thanks, Dan. Cat on, cat off. Yeah, I mean, hey, if you had a state called cat, you could turn it on and off. Absolutely. Sweet, a coupon. Yeah, you get a coupon, Dan. So it does say here, your first idea likely won't be the best, but that's okay. Refactoring states is part of the process. So, and that's the very next step is removing any non-essential state variables. So we want to avoid duplication in state content. So we're only tracking what is essential. Spending a little time on refactoring state structure will make your components easier to understand, reduce duplication, and avoid unintended meanings. Your goal is to prevent the cases where the state in memory doesn't represent any valid UI that you want the user to see. Okay? So you want to avoid UIs, you want to avoid accidentally displaying UIs that don't make sense. And you may have seen this before. I've seen this before a few times on certain websites where clearly something has gone wrong, probably in the state, um, of a web page where, for example, maybe you typed in a wrong answer to a question and you click submit and it said, oh, here's a good example. So you're filling out a form and certain fields are required, right? And maybe you try to submit the form once and it says, hey, and the page reloads and it keeps all of everything filled out in the form, but it gives you an error message saying, hey, you missed the form phone number, right? And and then it highlights the phone number field down below. So you're like, okay, fine. And so you fill in your phone number, and but the error message doesn't go away. And maybe you can click submit and it fails again, saying, hey, this field is required, but you filled it out. And so that means that somewhere you've got some clashing states that aren't updating correctly and things just aren't syncing up. And so that's the danger of potentially having state mismatches where things are in conflict. And so, but when that happens, you're displaying a UI to the user that no longer makes sense. And so, for example, what they give here is they say, for example, you never want to show an error message and disable the input at the same time, or the user won't be able to correct the error. And I feel like I've seen stuff like that too before, right? You submitted a form, it tells you a field is required, but then it won't let you edit the field. Or maybe you filled the field out wrong and you submit it and it won't let you edit the field. And so that's a problem. That's an example of a problem with state, not you have two states which are in conflict with each other. So here's some questions we can ask about our state variables. Does this state cause a paradox? So for example, is typing and is submitting can't both be true. Let's confirm that, right? So is typing and is submitting both can't be true. Now, why is that? Well, probably because if I'm actively typing, I can't also be waiting on the form to submit at the same time. Like that's just not a valid thing that can be possible or should be possible, right? Both of these should not be allowed to be true at the same time. Because if I'm typing in the form, I don't want it to be possible for it to be also submitting at the same time. That's going to cause all sorts of different problems. And so right now, the way we've set up our state with these two being separate, these two are completely mutually exclusive from each other. These could both be true at the same time, potentially. The way we've written this right now, that's perfectly possible, right? Both of these could be set to true, potentially. They exist separate of each other, so they could both be true. So that's a problem. Problem number one. Um, so to remove this impossible state, we should probably combine these into a status that's more descriptive. So instead of a Boolean, maybe we want it to be a string. And that single status should be one of three values: typing, submitting, or success. Now, since by having one state controlling multiple things, such as the form, the button, that sort of thing, we're having the state be in charge of multiple things and have three options, then each of those can never occur at the same time, right? This can only be one thing at a time. It can only be typing, submitting, or success, which prevents that clash of the wrong things being true at the same time. Dan says, Meticulous says, the amount of times I wrote refactored in my commit notes. Yeah. And Dan says, forms are surprisingly hard to write well, right? Because you got to think about all the things that can go wrong. And so in this case, we're making it easier on ourselves by combining some of those separate states into a single state called status, which is then going to be in charge of multiple elements of the UI. Yeah, and we can't have multiple states at once. This state of status can only be typing, submitting, or success. It can't be typing and submitting at the same time. So that solves our problem. Mojave says, don't tell me how to write my funny nightmare form. And then, so the other question we need to ask is the same information available in another state variable already? Do we have overlap? So here's another example of that. Is empty, our state of is empty and is typing can't be true at the same time. By making them separate state variables, you risk them going out of sync and causing bugs. So what we could do instead is remove is empty altogether and then just check and see, all right, if our answer length is 0, I'll scroll it so you can see that. If answer length is 0, then do something, right? We don't necessarily need a state for that specific thing. We can instead just have an is typing state with a special condition of what happens when the length of the answer is 0, then do something. So we can get rid of that is empty state. That's good. We're narrowing it down. And then finally, can we get the same information from the inverse of another state variable? So is error is not necessarily needed. Instead, we can just see if error is not null. So if an error exists, then do something. All right, so where does that leave us? Well, in the end now, we're basically left with 3 states that we absolutely need. In the end, we're really just left with answer with a default of empty string, error with a default of null, and status, which could be one of 3 things: typing, submitting, or success. And with all 3 of these states, we can basically control every element of the UI in our component. Oh, thank you for the follow, Phil. Welcome to the stream. Kosova says, do we set those values? Yo, indeed, Phil. Kosova says, do we set those values like is there an event handler with what these states do? Yeah, we're going to get there in just a second. We're going to get to, so we have the states now. We're just, this is basically the part where we declare the variables that we're going to use later. And so after we've declared them, then we're actually going to write out the logic that does stuff with them. So this is really just we're building the storage bins here. We're setting up the initial values. We're setting up the variables that are going to hold the state. We're setting up the functions that are going to update the state, and then once we've set them up, we can actually start building the logic to use them. And we're going to skip this deep dive as well. I just don't want to get too deep in the weeds here for this very important topic right off the bat. But at the end, if there's time, we'll go back and hit these deep dives. All right, so to answer Kosova's question, the very next step is after we've declared our state variables, we do step 5, which is connecting our event handlers to actually set the state. All right, so how do we do that? Well, like we saw before, the first step is always importing use state. Then we set up our 3 state values: answer, error, and status. And by default, ooh, Ari, thank you for the Prime sub. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for that Prime sub. Let's cost Jeff Bezos some money. I love that. That's the best part. We're trying to make Jeff Bezos sell his cowboy hat so he can try to. So it's he's going to have to make some trade-offs if he wants to go to space again. Going to space is expensive, and we want to cost him as much money as possible to the point where he has to sell his cowboy hat. All right, so our initial state of our status is typing. And you might see like, that's weird. Because when the page loads, like somebody's not going to be typing right away, right? So like, how does that work? What the heck? Well, we'll see how that works in just a minute. So the first thing, the easiest part that we can do here is just say, hey, if status equals success, we just return an H1 that says that's right. And since we know the answer to this already, we can see how that looks. That's right. right? So what this is doing is it's taking the status and returning an H1. So by default, we know that something in the code down below, is flipping this status state from typing to success. So we're going to watch out for that flipper. Big hat, no cows, as they say here in Texas. He certainly has a big hat. All right, so first off, let me reset this. I'm gonna do this kind of in a specific order here. And actually two, I'm gonna open this in a new window too, so it's easier to see. And you can do this too. For any of these examples, you can open them in a new window by clicking the fork button, which makes it a lot easier to see. Okay, so let's look at how this is laid out. The actual return value, again, which is what's displayed right here, is we have our H2, we have our hard-coded text, and then we have our form. So the first thing I see here is an onSubmit, and this is called a what? This is a what? Yeah, it's event handler. Exactly. Yep. So this is another example of an event handler like we saw on click before, right? And so what this is doing then is it is calling, so onSubmit, so specifically when the form is submitted, it's going to call a function called handleSubmit. Okay, and we'll look at that in a minute. And then we also have our text area down here. So the value of this text area is going to correspond to the answer state. Okay, so, and by default, the answer state is set to empty string. And we can clearly see that here, right? So when the form first renders, the value of the form is set to the answer state, and that is an empty string. So therefore, the text box is empty. Text area, value set to answer state, empty text box. Now, this is where the magic happens. On change, we call the function handle text area change. Okay? So handle text area change is going to control what's displayed in the text area. So let's look at that. Handle text area change is going to call our set function for the answer state. And it's going to take in whatever is being typed in the box. Each time something changes in the box, we are calling the set function for the answer state, which then updates what's stored in our answer state variable, right? And then the value of the text area is updated based on what is stored in the answer state variable. So do we see the path here? Right? Initially, the value is set to the answer state, which is an empty string. On change, whenever somebody does something in that box, in that text area box, it calls this function over and over and over and over and over and over, and over again, which then calls the function to update the answer state, which then updates the value in the text box. Does that make sense? So can you see the cause and effect loop here? Basically, all we're doing is we are capturing whatever the user is typing, we're storing it in the answer state, and then we are displaying it back to the user in the box. So essentially, we're kind of abstracting the things that we're typing in this box and we're storing them elsewhere. We're not storing them in the box itself like we would with basic HTML. If I just built this form out of HTML, this whatever I'm typing in here would not be captured. It would just be typed in and displayed right back to me, right? It's not captured in itself. But by adding state into the mix, we're storing it elsewhere. We're capturing it elsewhere. So potentially I could use what's being typed here. I could use this in another component because I'm storing it in state. This is the power right here. We're taking this out of the box itself and storing it in state, which I could potentially use anywhere else I wanted, depending on where I put my state, but conceptually. Um, so this is a little bit different than how we would normally handle a form box, right? Yeah, and we could also, so let me see if I wonder if I could look at this in the React. If I could look at this in, curious to see here. This might be too, since I'm trying to look at it in the sandbox itself. I wanted to see, because if you look at a web page that's powered by React, you can actually see the state updating as you type in the form box. It's pretty cool. Oh, there's a little console tab at the bottom of the preview window. Console. Okay. And you're saying wanted to add a console log line and handle text area change. Yeah, we can do that. Um, Now this will only show the previous value because it's not going to update, but it's close enough, I think. So we'll do console log answer. All right. There we go. Okay, watch this. Do you see it? You see it? That's the state updating as we type. So each time I type a new letter, it's changing the value that is stored in our answer state. Okay? Yeah, that was a good idea, Dan. Thank you for that. Frederico says, I'm new to the channel. Do these streams usually last a set amount of time, or is it just until we get through with the documentation? So some of my older streams that you'll find on YouTube are much longer. But in modern times, I generally limit the content part of the stream to 3 hours. So we started at 3 p.m. Eastern. It is now 4:45 Eastern. So we've got about another hour's worth of content left to go, hour and 15. And then sometimes we'll chat for a little while afterwards, just about whatever we want, sort of free for all in the chat. But content itself generally lasts about 3 hours. So that way you can kind of plan accordingly, depending on how long you have to tune in. Okay, so we're storing state inside of our, so we're storing the value of the text box inside of answer and updating that every single time we make a change in the text box. Now you'll notice there's another additional value here, whereas the value of disabled, so is set to status equals submitting. So does anybody have any ideas what might be happening here? What do you think we're trying to do with this line right here? Any guesses? Just conceptually, if you're not sure, think about what we want to happen when somebody does submit the form. We're doing a comparison. That's right. Yes. So the triple equals is we're checking, right? We're checking for something. So what do we think we're doing? Latendor says disable the submit button. You're close, but not quite. Yeah, exactly. Raz Wonders has got it exactly right. Yep. What we're doing here now is we are disabling the text box if the status state is in submitting. So while we are submitting the form, we don't want it to be possible to type in the text box, right? That's just something we said we wanted early on. You don't want to have people typing in the box while it's being submitted. That could cause all sorts of problems, the wrong data getting submitted, the user not understanding what's been submitted. So we want to disable this text box and not allow people to type in it if it's currently being submitted. So that's all we're doing there. All right. And then something similar for the button itself also. If our answer length is 0, or got the double pipes here, which mean or, the status is submitting, we want it to be disabled. And then if there is an error, we want to disable the error, or sorry, we want to display the error message. All right. So we can see how state is being utilized multiple times and multiple places within this form to directly influence its behavior, to switch things on and off, to show, hide certain elements. And we aren't doing that directly, right? The state is controlling that. And what controls the state? Well, user interaction, right? Whether somebody's typing in the box, whether somebody's clicked a button. So we aren't setting that ourselves. We're letting state handle it, and then the state is controlled by user interaction. Dan says, government telling me how to use my forms, grumble, grumble. All right, so one of the things that we kind of glossed over earlier was this handle submit. So we looked at some of the individual simple applications of state here, right? And now let's look and see what this event handler is actually doing when the user clicks the submit button. So it's calling this handle submit function. So we'll scroll up and see that. Handle submit right here. So handle submit takes one, has one parameter here, which is E. What does E stand for? In general, in JavaScript, what do we use E for? It's an abbreviation for something. Yeah, it's an event. Exactly. It's an event. And events can be a lot of things. We can, again, it's basically what we use event handlers for, right? Event handlers capture an event, and we're passing that event into this handle submit function. Okay? So event handlers handle events, and then we can pass the information about that event into our function. And so in this case, the event that we've captured is a click. Well, sorry, it's captured the click, and it's passing in the answer. And the first thing we do here is we prevent default. So what we're doing there is certain events can have some default behavior. So for example, if you have a form with a submit button and you click that button, by default, the way that forms work is they reload the page. They clear the form and they reload the page. That behavior is sometimes helpful, but in the case of React, we don't want that. We want to control the behavior ourselves. We don't want to rely on this default. We want to control everything via state and abstract it out of the element itself. And so what we're doing here is we're preventing any default behavior. We're gonna handle it ourselves. And then we call our set status to set the state of our status to submitting. Gosh dang, I swear they did that on purpose. Too many S's. We set the state of status to submitting from typing, because it was in typing before. We were typing in the box. And then as soon as we set it to submitting, it will trigger all of those other changes that we looked at before, right? It's going to disable the text box. It's going to disable the submit button. It's going to make it so we can't make any changes until the submission is complete. So the next thing we do is a try. We wait for the submission to finish, and we pass in whatever is in the answer state. We pass that into our submit form function, which we'll look at in a second. And then if it's successful, if this try is successful, we await the submission, it's successful, we flip the status of our we flip the state of status to success. And then as soon as we do that, the text box will become editable again. Or sorry, well, I guess once we do that, no, it's going to do this. It'll pass into this if right here. The next time that when the component re-renders, it's going to pass into this if right here, and it's going to return H1. If it's not right, we're going to catch the error. We're going to set the status back to typing. The text box will become editable again. And we're going to set the error state to contain whatever error message we get. Okay? I wish I could prevent default on my student loans, but yeah. Funny but sad, indeed. Frederico says, are forms always asynchronous? Well, in this case, we do have a try catch block here, right? And so we want to await the success or failure of this particular function before we proceed with the rest of the code, right? We need to await this. We don't want to get out of sync. And so in this case, that's why we have, that's why we made this async. In general, I think you'll see that because you're going to have, at least most of the time, you're going to have forms talking to like a database. You're gonna be submitting something to a database, and then you're gonna be awaiting a success or a failure. And so you're gonna want to wait to make sure that whatever was maybe written to the database successfully, or read from the database successfully, that could take some time. And so a lot of the times when you're interacting, when you're sending form data to a database, you're going to see that be asynchronous. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at this. Let's look at submit form. So what's happening when we submit the answer state into submit form? So first thing we're doing is we're setting a promise and a timeout. So this is interesting how they're handling this. So we're passing in the answer, setting a promise. It can either be resolved or rejected. And we're setting a timeout. And we're saying, if the answer is not Lima, essentially. Oh, so I guess, well, this is a Boolean, right? It's saying let should error, and it's checking to see whether or not it's equal to Lima. So if should error is true, then we reject the promise and we send back our error message. And so that's what's going to display in the catch block of our try catch block. It's going to default to that. It's going to grab the error message, and it's going to set our error state to be equal to this error message right here. If it's not, then we successfully resolve the promise. There's no error message to pass back, and then close out the timeout. I think they put a timeout in here just to show the submitting state, so that we can see that. You can see how it pauses for a moment before it gives the wrong answer. So I'll do it again. See that's the timeout right there that's being triggered. Boop. That's the timeout. 1500 milliseconds or whatever. I think that's a second and a half. Yeah. So that's the timeout being called. And then if this should error is true, it passes through the error message like we see right here. That's that error message. And then else we resolve. I think there was, Trinae asked, when do we reset the error status? In this case, we don't. If we get it right, I'll just show you what happens if we get it right. And you can see that, again, the state is being updated down there at the bottom. If I submit that, it still does the timeout, but it resolves the promise successfully. And so if that submit is successful, our try catch block, we await the answer, the submit status is set to success, and then we simply return an H1. So at this point, the form has disappeared, so there's no way to get back to the form. And so that error status is not, it doesn't get touched. We can reset it. If I reload, it's going to set everything back to, default. And so all these will get set back to their initial values. Yeah, it's 1.5 seconds. Yep, that's what I thought. Mm-hmm. And Federico says, is the submit form function just acting as the backend in this example? Yeah, basically. We're the reason that they put that timeout in there is because we are mimicking a server call, as TED Talks said. Welcome to the stream, by the way, TED Talks. That's a great answer. Yeah, we are mimicking a server call, which can sometimes take some time, often take some time to complete, because you're talking to a database, you're getting information back and forth, and so yeah, it's often not going to be immediate. Thank you for the follow, Samu Devs and TED Talks. Thank you so much. Good to be here. Yeah, I'm glad to have you, TED Talks. Yeah, and you can also, Bobby says that you could also mock this up to have an actual backend if you wanted, but for this particular example, it's not necessary. But yeah, this, you know, forms are great because it's so easy to just mock up a server, or it's so easy to just add a server and a backend to them. Forms are my favorite. They're my favorite HTML thing because they're just so versatile. I love them. All right. So that's how we are actually applying the various states that we have and making them control our UI rather than us controlling the UI manually, each element of the UI manually. We can see how, for example, status, our status state, is controlling an awful lot of stuff all at once, right? It's controlling whether or not our text box is editable. It's controlling whether we can click buttons. It's controlling what we display, right? If status is success, then we don't even display the form anymore. Um, it's controlling what gets stored in our, answer state, which again, we can see that it was reset back to the initial value because we reloaded the page. So it got reset back to the initial value. And the initial value is just an empty string. Okay. All right. So I'm about to move on to the next, to explore this even more. We're going to go back to the docs. But before I move off of this example, are there any questions? And feel free to, open these examples on your own screen and mess around with them. You can play with them right in the browser. Just click the fork button from the docs themselves. Any example you want to play with, you can just click fork. It'll open in a new window, and you can experiment with it to your heart's content. So, any questions before we go back to the docs? And feel free to add a bunch of console logs to this. See what the state is at a given point. That'll help you explore it a lot better. Dan says people may hear this type of thing referred to as a controlled component. I think I've heard that word as well. Basically, we're talking about something like a form, which may have inherent functionality, but we're essentially taking that functionality away and controlling it remotely. Yeah, like Dan said, essentially we're controlling both the inputs and the outputs of this text box. So technically, with pure HTML, the text box could do this itself, right? We aren't adding any functionality here. Text boxes already know how to display things that we type into them. That's something that they can do by default. But what we're doing here is we're scooping out that functionality and we're moving it out into state. So we're taking and we're saying, all right, I'm going to handle all your inputs and outputs from now on. I'm going to take in what's typed into you and I'm going to store it in state. And then I'm going to tell you exactly what I want you to display. Yeah. It kind of reminds me of, I watched like The Last of Us, and it kind of reminds me of like the cordyceps fungus in The Last of Us, right? Humans are perfectly capable of doing things on their own, but the cordyceps then says, "Nah, I'm going to take that over from you. I'm going to control you from now on. I'm going to control, what you do and all the things you could do before. I'm going to control that." Ari says, "Are all past talks stored on YouTube?" Yep. stuff stays on Twitch for 60 days. But prior to that, prior to it expiring on Twitch, I move all my stuff to YouTube. So exclamation point YouTube in chat, which Frederico has helpfully done for us. Thank you, Fred. Latjor says cordyceps, are they the ones that attack ants? Yeah, if you're not familiar, cordyceps is a fungus that essentially infects insects. It doesn't have to be just ants, it could be other things. And it takes control of their motor functions. So they can still walk and move and all those things that they used to do, but the fungus controls them now. And so that's kind of basically what we're doing here. We're taking away the independent functioning of these text boxes, and we are controlling we're controlling their inputs and outputs for our own purpose. Zombie ants. Yeah, basically, it literally, yes. And so that's literally what we're doing here, right? Text boxes can do this, but we're instead saying, nope, I'm your brain now. I control you. Yeah, nature is fun. All right. Feel free to ask additional questions as you think of them. We're going to go back to the main docs for now. So this is the example we just looked at. And they just say, okay, so this code that we just looked at, that whole thing, is longer than the original example, actually, like by lines of code, but it is much less fragile because, as we saw, we're expressing everything, any interaction, any change, as state changes, and state can control multiple things at once. So we can introduce new visual states later without breaking existing ones, because since we're not editing the behavior of individual buttons and things and creating all this complex logic. Instead, state just determines which version of the UI is displayed at a given time. And it also lets us change what should be displayed in each state without changing the logic of the interaction itself. Frederico says that's the first parasitic programming analogy I've heard. Oh, yeah. I'm happy to be the first. Hopefully not the last. Fragile forms, yeah. All right, so a quick recap here. What we're doing is declarative programming. And that means we are just describing what we want. We're describing the end result that we want rather than telling the UI exactly how to get there, right? We're just saying, hey, give me this when my state is X. When my state is typing, do this. When my state is submitting, do this. When my state is I don't know what, I forget what the other one was, whatever the third one was. When it's that, do this, right? We're not saying exactly how to get there. We're just saying, give me this. Another example of declarative programming actually is SQL. So the language that I work with every day, it's SQL is a little bit unfamiliar to folks sometimes because basically you're doing the same thing that we're doing here with React. Is you're basically just saying, hey SQL, I want this from the database. I want fields, first name, last name, and ID from table students. You're not telling it how to retrieve that information. You're just saying, this is what when you come back, this is what I expect to see from you. And so SQL is also declarative in that way. So it was kind of interesting for me to learn that because that's what I do. And so learning JavaScript was actually a bit weird, but now we're getting back to, the more declarative stuff. We're saying, all right, yeah, I understand, I understand declarative. That makes sense. And just giving commands. I like that. Bossing, React specialty. Yeah, essentially that's what we're doing here, right? We're saying, hey, when these criteria are met, do this with the UI. If those criteria are not met, do something else with the UI. But we don't really care how it gets done, just do it. So when we're developing a component, we want to identify all of its potential states, particularly the visual states, right? How we want it to look. Number two, we determine the human and computer triggers that will cause state changes. Maybe it's clicks, maybe it's network responses, maybe it's hovers, I don't know, lots of things. Maybe it's a timeout, who knows? And then we model that state with use state that we talked about before. We review our states that we've modeled and make sure that none of them are going to conflict with each other to the best of our ability. And then we remove any non-essential states to avoid bugs and paradoxes. And then finally, we connect our event handlers to actually call the set state functions to update state accordingly. Yeah, Frederico says, asks, are they just putting imperative in parentheses for contrast? Yeah, so they're basically reminding, so this is declarative, and then they're just saying, hey, if you are micromanaging the UI like you would have to with vanilla JavaScript, where you would be writing individual logic for each UI element, right? You would have to, for every single button, for every single text, for every single, you would have to take in all the possible things that the user could do, and then all the possible things that the button should do or the text box should do, right? That's very micromanaging. You're directly controlling the logic yourself. And so that's an example of imperative. It is a really good recap, isn't it? Yeah. uh Champlok says, can you explain refs for me? um if someone in chat wants to, that's perfectly fine. All right, so now that we've kind of talked about state, how to apply it, how to use it, let's do some challenges. And we're going to do challenges, just FYI, we're going to do challenges 1 and 2. We're not going to do challenge three, because I don't want to. This challenge 3, for some reason, they have you refactor the code without using React at all. And I don't think that's productive. You can try it if you want, but we're just going to do challenge 1 and 2. Ladro says, soon it will be not just true and false, but true, maybe, and false. Yeah, if we're getting into quantum computing, absolutely. You can have those little qubits that don't equal true or false. That'll be weird. All right, so let's look at what they want us to do here. Add and remove a CSS class. So make it so that clicking on the picture removes the background dash dash active CSS class from the outer div. So if we're looking at the code here, we can see that this div has a background active class, right here. So that if we click on the picture, they want that to go away. And then also it should add the picture dash dash active class to our image. So under the class list here, they want it to also add picture dash dash active. Clicking the background again should reverse this and restore the original CSS classes. So visually, what they want is clicking on the picture removes the purple background and highlights the picture border. So that's what those classes are going to do. So this background active class causes a purple background to appear, and then the picture active class should cause a purple border to appear instead. So clicking outside the picture highlights the background, but removes the picture border highlight. So, okay, that makes sense. All right, so let's think about how we might want to do this. So obviously we're going to need to be using some state, right? We're going to have some kind of a state that's going to change depending on where we've clicked. Yeah, Joy, you're absolutely right. Thank you for sharing that information with Rex. Yeah, and Dan, thank you for giving that wonderful explanation to Champlock as well. Yeah, we haven't talked about refs yet. I don't want to get like too, you know, into new concepts other than state, but thank you for explaining that. I appreciate that. Excellent. Just and Dan also excellent explanations in general too. I do appreciate your contributions in the chat, and everybody else too. Hey Viper, thanks for stopping in. Okay, so what do we need here? Well, we're going to need, obviously, we're going to need some kind of a state that's going to control um, which, which classes are associated with which elements. Okay, so thinking in general, if I want to use state here, what do I need? What's the first thing I should do? If I'm going to use state in any component, what's the first thing I need to do before anything else? And thank you for the follow, Viper Gamings. What's item one? Even before Kosovo, even before we declare states, this is important. This is something that you'll probably forget at least once. Those are not incorrect answers. But what do we need to do first? Yeah, and as Federico and Kosovo said, yes, the very first thing we need to do is import, right? Import so we can actually start making use of state. Import use state from React. That's the very first thing. Look at me being all proper. I even put a semicolon at the end. Aren't you proud of me? I never use semicolons. Okay, so now we can actually start declaring some states. So, obviously there's a variety of ways you can do things, right? Everybody's slightly different, but I'm really thinking this seems like kind of like an off-on situation, right? Right? Either the full background is on, or just the picture background is on, right? So it's like it's an either or type situation. So I'm thinking, yeah, either or. So either one is true or the other is true. Um, so how many state let's do it this way. How many state variables do you think I might want to use? To make sure we don't end up with any conflicts. How many state variables do you think I might want to declare? Yeah, I'm really thinking. I'm thinking so we can avoid conflicts and we can avoid, you know, potential clashes. I'm really thinking we're just only going to want to use one, and that value is probably only going to be true or false, right? Either we are displaying the full background and not the picture background, or the picture background and not the full background. And I think we can probably handle that using a Boolean. So, if our state is true, then we show, I don't know, then we show picture background. If state is false, then we show, this background here. We may have to change that assumption later on, but let's start with one, and that'll make sure that we cannot possibly have any conflicts. Yeah, and we could call it background. You could call it whatever, whatever makes sense. Um, I'm thinking that I'm going to use is active here, but it's really whatever makes sense. And then we need to set the initial value. I'm going to set my initial value of use state to false. So now we have a Boolean, and we can make use of that in our logic down below. And I think another thing I want to do is there's a lot of hard coding going on here, right? We know we're going to be changing these. We know we're going to be changing these class names anyway. So I'm going to take these out. And I want to put them in variables instead. These class names are going to change. I want to take them out, and we're going to store them inside of, we're going to store them inside of variables, which are going to be triggered by our state. All right. So I'm going to say, background class name is going to be equal to background. There we go. That looks very pretty. I like it. Is that Brazil, do you think? And then, oops. Go. Picture class name is going to be equal to picture. And then we can store those in and I guess we don't necessarily have to, well, yeah, we'll keep things kind of, I think this will be simpler in the long run, but now I can go ahead and plug these uh, background class name and picture class name as variables into the actual values on the div. Okay, so if I want to use a variable inside of this class name, such as background class name, like this, if I want to put this here, what do I need to do? It's inside of a div. What do I need to do? Oh, Indonesia. Okay, thank you, Lajor. Oh, and thank you for the posture check too. I'm such a gremlin. I hunch over, man, like a gargoyle on top of on top of Notre Dame. Like I'm always like, so I appreciate it. Yes, it appears to be Indonesia. Very pretty. Um, oh yeah, and Trinae is saying that I need to use brackets. Why is that? Why do I need to do? Why can't I just do this? Why doesn't that work? Why, if I do this, now that worked. Why do I need the Why do I need the brackets? I'm going to do the same thing down here. Do this. And that. Yeah. Like Frederica said, brackets take you to JavaScript land. Exactly. Yep. So what we're doing here is we're going into we're going from markup into JavaScript and then back out again, right? So the brackets, like we said before, the brackets are like our window into JavaScript. So if I want to do anything JavaScript related inside of my markup, I need to make sure that I wrap it in brackets so that React is aware of what we're trying to do. Yep. Exactly. All right, so this is a good start. We've got our class applied. We can clearly see the styling is working, right? Good stuff. Now let's figure out how we can use our newly created state and bring that into our logic a little bit. So, um, oops. I think what we're going to do, let's see, I think they specified that they want this to trigger specifically on a click. So we're going to capture that click. We want to capture that click via an event handler, right? Some kind of an event handler. We want to capture the click, and what that's going to do is flip our state. Who doesn't like nested breath? Yeah, exactly. Lajor, yes, we're going to use an event handler on click. And so essentially what we want to happen is when I click the image, so we're going to want our event handler to be on the image itself. So on the image tag, we're going to add an event handler on click, which is going to cause our state to flip. So I think what we're going to do here is we're going to have it on click. Event handler should set our state to true. So our logic should then, on a true value, on when our is active state is true, it should add the that particular picture active class to our picture class name variable. If that didn't make sense, we'll walk through it. We'll actually do this in a minute, but that's just me talking through it. So what we want to do is on click, we're going to set our active state to true, which means the picture is the active focus. We'll set that to true. And then we want to add that picture active class to this variable that we've already created. Okay? Thank you for the follow, Gallows. And Latjar says, but the on click for particular divs, I mean elements. Yes, exactly. We're going to want to be careful where we put that event handler so that it's in the right place and it's listening for the right clicks. Yep. So let's go ahead and do that. That might make it clearer what we're trying to do here. Um, so I want to only listen for clicks on the image itself. So I'm going to put my event handler inside of the image tag here. So I can, in order to do that, I can just say on click. So to listen for clicks inside of the image tag, um, take in the click, and then do stuff, right? We can do this. This is this is allowed. This is an anonymous function inside of an event handler, and so we can go ahead and just set the state change right there. So on click, we want to on click we want the change the state to change from false to true. So how do I do that? How do I do that? How do I set my active state from false to true? I'll scroll up a little bit so you can see. If I want to change this state, how do I set it to its new value of true? Yes, so we're going to need to use, ooh, interesting. Okay, so let's think carefully. State is special, right? State is special. And when we declare state for the first time, when we declare a state variable for the first time, we declare the variable itself. This stores the state value. But then we have this second thing here. Yeah, exactly. We need to make sure that whenever we're updating state, we always call the specific update function that's made for updating this state value. It's a little different than a regular variable. If we want to change the value, we have to call this function. Okay? That's why I asked, because it's important to remember that we have to use this specifically to make that update. Okay? Yeah. Set is active right here. This triggers the update. We can't update state directly. We have to call the correct function which we declared up here when we declared the state variable. Okay? Yeah, there you go. You got it. All right. So we can do that here. Perfect. And we already set this class name. So as soon as we have the logic to properly handle this, that'll just fix itself. And then that's fine. Okay. So we have the state flipper, right? And so now we can start putting together but also we need to also then flip the state the other direction too, right? So if I click the image, the state should be flipped to true. If I click outside of the image, we want that state to flip to false to trigger the other class. So we need to basically just do the reverse. So I'm going to put that inside of the div here. Do a very similar thing. So on click, I'll just copy this. If I click outside of the oh, and I forgot to close brackets, sorry. There we go. We just want to set this to false. So click inside the image, active state to true. Outside the image, active state to false. So now we have we have our state working, or theoretically, we have our state working. So now we can build some logic that triggers off of that state change to apply or remove the appropriate class. All right, so if I want to do that, now I can take advantage of my state and have some logic to, basically apply or remove those classes however I need to. All right, so I think what I can do here is really just do a check and say, hey, if is active is true, like we talked about before, if is active is true, apply the picture active class to my picture class name. So that should be fairly straightforward. If is active is true, we're doing, using truthy values here. If is active is true, then picture class name, we can simply add an additional value to it. Okay. If it's not true, then we do this instead. What is that? Background active. There we go. So now, as soon as I did that, we can see that the state is being applied, right? Because by default, our state is set to false. That's what we said our initial value should be. So following this logic, if is active is false, we go into our else condition and we add the background active class to our div, right? And so that's what we get. And Awais asks, I have a question. Suppose we have a container which has many child elements. When we change the state of the container, all of the child elements will also be re-rendered. Yes. Yep. Yeah, that component is going to re-render itself and take in any changes to state that might affect the display. Frederico says, should background class names and picture class name also be state variables? So we're handling all state with use state. No. In this case, no, because think about it. Let's little thought exercise here. What happens? Well, okay. We always want this to be an either or condition, right? We always want that. We always want either the background or the picture to be active, right? They should never be active at the same time. We want it always to be either one or the other. If we had the background as a state value and the picture as a separate state value, conceivably, potentially, something could happen, something could go wrong where both of those could be active since they're separate values. There's nothing stopping them, right? If they are separate values, something could happen where both of them end up active or both of them end up inactive. That's not good. That's not what we want. We always want it to be either one or the other. So by using a single state value and having that control both the background and the picture, we can always ensure that only one of them is going to be active at one time, and there will never be a situation where both of them are active or none of them are active. It's a little bit of a thought exercise, right? We kind of saw that earlier when we were looking at that example farther up in the docs with the form, right? We never wanted there to be a situation where you could type in the box while it was being submitted, right? Like that those things should never coexist. And so what we did is instead of having those be separate, having the submission be a state and the typing be a state. Instead, what we did is we combined them into a single state with those being options in that state. So you can never have both of them happening at the same time. Does that make sense, Frederico, why we did that? Because technically, yes, they could be like physically, yes, they could be their own states, but do we want them to be their own states? No. We want to control their behavior in such a way that we stop those potential errors and issues from happening. Yeah, and how the best way for us to do that in this case is by having these be standard variables which are themselves controlled by a single state. A puppeteer of sorts. Exactly, Mavi. Right. Cyber Benny says, starting my new job tomorrow. Congratulations, Cyber. Good job. What are you going to be doing? Like just in a general sense, what tools are you going to be using? All right, so let's finish this out. We're almost done. Um, so I think we can test and see if it works. All right. So theoretically, if I were to click on the picture, I should see the background appear on the picture and the background and the background go away, right? Okay, let's see. Huh, I clicked. I clicked, but nothing's happening. I wonder why. Now, I'll give you a clue. Let's see if anybody catches it. I'll give you a clue. We've done everything right so far, but there's one more thing we need to do. Yeah, like would be congrats to Cyber Benny. Absolutely. iOS, you'll be working on a Banks app. Oh, that's exciting. That's awesome. Doing some mobile development. Really cool. So there's one more thing we need to add to this in order to make it function properly. Now, I'll give you a clue as to what else we might need to do here. Here we have the background is a div, right? The background is a div which contains an image tag. So the image is inside of the div. Now, a couple streams ago, we talked about something that can cause problems with event handlers when you have an element inside of another element and you interact with that child element. We have something that can happen where think about if you're at what happens if you're at the bottom of the pool and you dove down to the bottom of a pool and you exhale. What do you see happening? We drown. No, we don't need to take anything away, Trinae. We need to add something. I can't swim. Bubbles. Yeah, exactly. Like Kosova said. Yeah, and Kosova nailed it there. What we need to do, well, actually, no, Kosova, you're close. But you're thinking about the wrong method. But you're close. You're close. Yeah, but what happens is bubbles, right? You're at the bottom of a pool, you blow bubbles. And the same thing happens when you have an event that's inside of a child. If we don't prevent it, that event will bubble from the child through all of its parents. And so that's what's happening here is I am clicking on the image and things are occurring as they should, but I'm clicking on the image and that event, that click event bubbles from the image up to the div. And so it's like I clicked them both. If I just want to capture that event at the child level, at the level of this image, and I want to stop it. I want to capture those bubbles before they go up any farther. You know, you hold your hands like this and you hold the bubbles. If I want to do that, how do I do that? We learned a way to do that previously when we were talking about event handlers. Yeah, it's propagation. Exactly. Yep. Good job. Both John Coco and Trinae. Yep. Exactly. We're talking about propagation. So all I need to do to stop this weirdness that's occurring is just say e dot stop propagation, maybe. And what that'll do is it'll capture the click at the image level and it won't let it travel up to the div and cause bad things to happen. So let's try this again. Ah, hello. Ah, there we go. Now it's working. My state is flipping back and forth. The click is being captured at the appropriate level. So now when I click this, the click is stopped. The state is flipped to true. The class name here is changed to add picture active. And the UI is updated accordingly. Yeah. Okay. And Kasava asked a good question there. It says, Mayan, could you please explain propagation versus prevent default? Yes, those are two different things. you'll see them both be applied to events, right? Like right here, you'll see both of them have e dot prevent default or e dot stop propagation, but they are entirely different things. So we just saw what propagation is, right? Propagation means bubbles. Propagation means stuff moving up the chain, up from child to parent. That's what happens by, that's just a thing that happens. And so if you want to stop that from happening, use stop propagation. Now, prevent default prevents any default behavior of the element itself. So um, we talked a little bit earlier about forms. So if I just have an HTML form, when I type in that form, if that form has a submit button and I click that submit button, stuff is going to happen. Even if I don't have any JavaScript associated with that form, it's still going to have default behavior. It's going to reload the page and it's going to clear the form, right? And that's if I have zero JavaScript whatsoever. That is a default behavior of that particular element. And so with React, a lot of the times we don't want that default behavior to happen. We want to control it ourselves using state and props and other things. And so if I want to stop that behavior from happening, I use e.prevent default to stop that behavior from happening and control it ourselves. Okay? So that's the difference. Propagation stops that bubbling of an event up the chain, whereas default behavior focuses on the element, it's on the event itself, and stops any default behavior that would be triggered by that event. Okay? So Domino says, would background class name and picture class name ever need to be their own states or use ref? If not, then why not? Yeah, so we talked about this a little bit earlier, and it really depends on the use case. What are you trying to do? So here, in this particular example, they have very strictly told us that this should always be an either or situation, right? At any point, either the picture or the background should be active. At no point should both the picture and the background be active, or neither the picture and the background be active. There should always be one active at a given point. So if we had each of those as their own state, if the picture was one state that could be true or false, and the background was also a state that could be true or false, there is the potential that things could get out of sync and both of those states could be false, meaning, maybe neither of them are active, or both of them could be true, meaning both of them are active. And those are things that we don't want. So in order to completely eliminate that possibility, we don't want them to be their own states. We want them both to be controlled by a singular state that's either true or false, to switch them both off and on. So that way we can force them to be to fall in line under this single state, because they're associated with each other, right? The picture and the background, they are completely linked together, and they should therefore be controlled by one singular state. However, if they were completely independent of each other and we wanted them to be able to, both be active, both be not active, maybe the picture has different possibilities. Maybe it could be made bigger or smaller, or completely independent of the background. Maybe we want the background to stay purple, but the picture should be able to shrink and grow in size and move around the page. Then yeah, that could be a case for them to each be their own states. But it just depends on what relationship do you want them to have, right? In this case, they need to be completely linked together, and their behavior needs to depend on what the other one is doing. And so in that case, we want them both controlled by a single state, which is going to update them both depending on what that state is. However, if they needed to be independent from each other, then yeah, we could have them be separate. But it's all about asking yourself those questions. And so they have a list of questions here that you should ask yourself when you're thinking about state, right? First, we want to identify all the visual possibilities. What's going to need to happen visually that the user should be able to see. And then what's going to trigger those changes? What actions? Is it going to be clicks, scrolls, hovers? What's going to trigger those changes? So we identify those conceptually, and then we model out the states. So initially we might think, yeah, I need the background to be its own state. I need the picture to be its own state. And then if we think about it a little bit more, we need to think about what problems that could potentially cause. So essentially the problems I just talked about, right? It could potentially cause some problems, especially if you make the logic more complex later on. Yeah, you could absolutely end up with both of them true, both of them false, and that's not something you ever want to happen. So in that case, we would remove those non-essential states and make a single state to control them both. And then we, in the end, then we wire up our event handlers. So if you follow these steps, it's a pretty good way of at least making your first draft somewhat accurate. You might not get it right the first time, right? There might be cases you don't even think of, and you're like, I didn't even know that could happen, right? And then you got to go back later and you got to refine things even more. But this is I like this list. It's a good list for kind of critical thinking about states and how you might want to put them together. And thank you for the follow, Dominoes. Yeah, exactly. We follow the KISS method. Yep. Keep it simple, silly. Yeah, one state per component. We don't want to make our puppeteers fight each other. You don't want conflicts or paradoxes. Yeah, this is an excellent recap. I really like it. Um, yeah, great steps to follow. Yeah, and Dan says, "I wish it could only be every one state." Yeah, I don't think you're not always gonna be able to do one state per component, right? That's not always going to be true, but it's all about what is the fewest number of states that's going to cause the cleanest execution of these changes, right? You just want it to be clean. Okay, this is great. Um, yeah, and to be clear, these are still variables, but they aren't state variables, right? To be clear, you can still have regular variables. It doesn't mean introducing state means we doesn't mean we can't have regular variables, but these are just regular variables that are influenced by state, right? The logic is triggered one way or the other depending on the current state. So don't get it twisted. You can have both state variables and your standard everyday vanilla variables. Those can exist together. Here in this case, our state variable right here influence the value of our picture and background variables. Okay? All right, let's do the second challenge here. But feel free to ask more questions. These have been fantastic questions so far. Really great. I really like this next. I really like this next example because it really shows how hard this would be if we were trying to do it in regular JavaScript, and then how implementing state can really help us make this less spaghetti code. So I'm going to do this in a new window. This one's pretty lengthy. Um, okay, make this bigger here. Yeah. Okay. So what's happening here? Well, we can see that we have a couple of default values here, first name and last name. And then we have a message down here, which appears to be kind of triggered off of these values, right? So first name Jane, last name Jacobs, hello Jane Jacobs. So I imagine there's some kind of computation going on of Jane plus Jacobs and dropping it into a message. Now let's see what happens if I click the edit profile button. Oh, hello. Now suddenly this becomes a form. And I can edit that form. What name should I put? What first name should I put? Give me first names and last names. Mine will. Okay. Now we can see as I'm typing, right? It's updating that value. So very clearly, I can almost like feel the implementation of state. We haven't implemented state yet because this is vanilla JavaScript, but this is a very clear place where we could do something with state to store these values and display them as the person is typing, right? Zombie ant. Bob Bubberson. Yeah, exactly. And so now I'm going to save profile and let's see what happens there. I click save profile. So several things have happened. This what I've typed here has kind of been set in stone, and I can't edit this right now, right? If I click here, I can't edit, doesn't work. Same here, can't edit, doesn't work. And the button has now the text on the button has also changed, right? Save, edit, save, edit. So if I go back and forth, there's a lot of UI based things happening here. So how are they doing that in vanilla JavaScript? Spoiler alert, it sucks. I'm not saying it's bad, but it's so convoluted. So we're not going to go over each line, but we're going to get a general feel of how they're doing this here. Um, so basically, they're saying, all right, if our button is set to edit, then we change the text on the button to say save, and we hide, show, and then else if the button was already set to edit, then we hide this, show that, and as we're typing, then we're trying to grab the text content from the form, and we're calling this name change function over and over and over and over again to update the content down here as we're typing. Same for last name. And we have to flip our display on and off um, for like showing and hiding elements. And then we have a crap ton of event listeners right down here, right? We have a crap ton of Smurfs that have to be attached to every single element. And yeah, it's gnarly, man. It's it's gnarly and it's repetitive, right? And what we're doing here is we're micromanaging our UI, right? Every single element, we have to micromanage it, and we also have to think of every possible combination that we could possibly encounter and how that's going to affect every single UI element. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if this was like multiple fields and you would have to, can you imagine if you're having to do multiple fields, validate those fields, do styling based on those fields? Yeah, it would be awful, right? Really bad. This is such a simple form, and yet it takes this much vanilla JavaScript to manage that form. So gross. Frederico says it illustrates why React is so useful. Yeah, absolutely. Instead of micromanaging our UI like we're doing here, let's just be clever about setting state and then have state update the UI for us in bulk as much as we need to. So let me see. I can't remember if they give us a separate sandbox for this. Yeah, they do. So we have a separate sandbox where they then want us to take this and refactor it into React. So the form switches between modes. In editing mode, you see the inputs. In viewing mode, you only see the result. The button label changes. And then when you change the input, the welcome message should update in real time. Your task is to re-implement it in React in the sandbox below. For your convenience, the markup was already converted to JSX, but you'll need to make it show and hide the inputs like the original does. Okay? And then we also want to make sure that it updates the text at the bottom as well. Yeah, so we can see here, I mean, the elements are all there, but none of the interactivity hasn't been wired up yet. All right, so I'm going to fork this into a separate window. If you're following along, I'd highly suggest you do the same, just to give you enough breathing room. Okay, so what's the first thing we need to do? Before we do anything else, what's the first thing we need to do? Yeah, exactly. Y'all have caught on now. I'm not gonna be able to. I'm not gonna be able to fool you again, am I? I was able to fool you the first time, but you won't get fooled again. All right, so we're gonna import. We're gonna import use state from React, right? Perfect. Okay, so now we can use it. And the other reason this is underlined is because we haven't used it yet, but we're about to. So open up ChatGPT. Yeah. Hey, there's nothing wrong with that. I just talked with somebody. I had a coffee chat with somebody yesterday, and they were talking. They were super worried about the, like a take home and stuff like that, and trying to cram, learning and trying to cram way too much learning into way too short of a time. And I was like, just have Chat GPT help you with this, And they were like, oh yeah, I could do that, couldn't I? I'm like, yeah, you could. Okay, so we have the ability to use states, so let's actually use it. Let's think about what states we might need in order to make this work. Um, so I'm going to go back to the original example here real quick. Um, I see right here, immediately right here, I see a binary kind of a situation, right? I see at any point I am either editing or I'm not editing, right? I'm either editing or I'm not. And so I think that's a state right there. I feel that I'm feeling a Boolean here, right? I can never be both editing and not editing at the same time. So I think that's something we're going to need to be able to flip on and off. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add that. We'll just say is it, so I'm either editing or I'm not. So is editing, and set is editing. And then by default, I think when the page first loads, if I go back to the original here, if I refresh this, yeah. So by default, I'm not editing. So by default, I think my state is going to need to be false. So use state false. Okay, so that's my first one. But I think that's not the only state I'm going to need, because I can be editing or not editing. And then let's say I am editing, right? Let's say I am editing and editing is set to true. I can, within that true status of editing, I can also be working in a form field, right? I can also be typing something. So like we talked about before, we want to, in general, when we have input boxes, we want to capture that input and store it in a state value of its own, because we want to be able to use it elsewhere. We want to be able to control other elements of the UI based on that particular state value. So I think I'm going to need to capture the things that I'm typing in the boxes into their own state. So, and also too, one thing to think about here is I can type in the first name, and then I can also type, I can save that just as is, right? I can leave last name blank, or I can type in last name and leave first name blank and save that. Or I can type in neither, or I can type in both, right? So it looks to me like these form fields are completely independent of each other. So what do we think I might want to do here, state-wise? Because their values don't seem to, we're using the values down here, right? But they don't seem to have any dependency on each other whatsoever. So what do we think I should do? Or what's a potential way we can handle this? Yeah, and like Trinae says, why don't we just have two states? One for the first name and one for the last name. So that way we can capture them independently. Potentially we could use them independently. And we could maybe send them to different components. Um, we could maybe have a message appear if first name is populated, um, saying enter last name or something like that. Um, and so what this would allow us to do is be a little bit more flexible with how we both capture and display this information. And Federico says, could you have a person state and initialize it as an empty object with properties first name and last name? Um, Potentially. Would that work? Somebody who's a little bit more seasoned with React, help me out here. Because with that, can we do that? Can we store like sub values like that and then access them in state? I That's not what we're going to do here. I'm just curious if that's possible. I've never seen that done, but I'm not saying it's not possible. Like what Federico says, is that physically possible to do, where you could have a state that's an object and then access individual uh, like keys of that object? Oh, thank you, Deadshot. I think the best solution in this particular case is to use two individual states because they are independent of each other. But not saying it can't be done. So I'm going to kind of copy and paste here a little bit. Maybe nobody else knows either. I'm really curious. First name, set, first name, and we'll also have last name and set. Oh, not is last name, sorry. There we go. Last name and set last name. Also, I need to correct my capitalization there. We need to make sure we have the correct case on these. Capitalize the F and the L. Frederico says, I know you can use an object to initialize state. You can also access the object's properties separately. Okay, cool. The more you know. Now, for these, since I copied and pasted, we have them set to Booleans, but that's not what we want, right? We're storing strings here. So based on I'm going to refresh the previous example. Based on what we see here in the UI, what do you think the initial value should be for my first name state? What should the initial value be? Because we have to give it an initial value. So what should that be based on just looking at the UI here? What should my initial value be? Yeah, right. It should be Jane, right? So my initial value here, when the page first renders, it's going to be Jane. What should the last name be? Initial value. Again, we're going to have another string. Jacobs, exactly. Yeah. Mavi, based on the problem we were given, Jane is supposed to be the default value that displays when you first initialize the component. So when the page first loads, that's what we want to see as a default value in the form. So that's why we're setting the default value of our state to that particular value. Somebody wrote a diary. Okay, so we've got our initial state set up, and now we can access those inside of our logic. Um, so this is the method one can use for Jane Doe placeholders. Yeah, it's the default value, Mavi. Exactly. Yep. So let's look at this first state first and where we might be able to use that. So primarily, we've created this editing state to help us flip between the two possibilities for our form, right? If I click this edit button, I want it to do a couple things. I want it to essentially make the form editable. Um, and let's see, what is it supposed to do? Yeah. So if I click it, I want it to make it editable. And then as soon as I click it again, it should change. Well, it should change the button text, make the boxes editable, um, and then kind of save the values that we've entered. So it needs to do a few things. So we're going to be able to apply this in a couple places. And so I want to target my form here, and this is essentially a form with a submit button. That submit button has different text in it, but it's a form with a submit button, right? We can see that down here. I can see that this is a form with a submit button. So if I want to control the behavior of what happens when I click that submit button, what do I need here to control that behavior directly? You can give me the specific name or just the general name of what we might need to use. What do I need here? What do I need to add to this form to take over like a cordyceps fungus, to take over the behavior of this form and register that somebody has clicked that submit button? I'm gonna hydrate. Mm. Yeah, we got a few good guesses there. Bridge Above says on click. Trinae says event handler. Yeah, great guesses. Great guesses. Yeah, absolutely. So we definitely need an event handler of some kind. Now, because this is a very specific instance, we have a form with a submit button. We actually have a specific event handler that we're going to apply here. So it is going to take in a click, but it's going to specifically handle the behavior on submit. Okay, so on submit, when they click that submit button, we want to handle that behavior. And so on submit, we're going to take in an event, which is the submit event itself. We're going to take that in, and we've already talked about this before. Forms have certain behavior that happens when you submit them, and we don't want that behavior to happen. We want to control that behavior. So what do I need to do? E dot what? You have two choices here. So see if you can remember which one suppresses the behavior of an element. We've got, okay, it's 50-50 now. We've got one person saying event propagation, the other one saying prevent default. Which one? Which one is it? You had a 50-50 chance. Hmm. What do we think? Okay. Ooh, we got a first time chatter coming in. Jay Herman, they're saying prevent default. And just like so many of my wonderful first time chatters, they are exactly correct. Coming in hot with that correct answer. Welcome to the stream, my friend. Yes. So we want to prevent. Thank you for the follow. We want to prevent the default behavior and stop that form from submitting and reloading the page and clearing the form. That is not behavior that we want to happen. And so what we do is we prevent that default behavior. Clap indeed. Indeed. Yes, absolutely. All right. So first we prevent the default behavior. I almost said it. I don't think I did, but I almost said it. It's so hard not to. um, okay, So the next thing we want to do then is just go ahead and on the click, we want to not only prevent the default behavior, we also want to flip to edit mode. Like we want to turn edit mode on or off. So I'm going to, I'm going to want to just flip my state value here. And so in order to do that, I can call the function that will allow us to flip that value. So I'm going to set is editing to whatever it wasn't, right? If we're in edit mode, I want this to turn edit mode off. If we aren't in edit mode, I want it to turn edit mode on. So I just want to do the opposite of whatever it currently is. And so probably the easiest way to do that is just to say this. Doop, doop. And what that will do is just flip it. Right? And Mavi says set is editing true. In this case, that won't give us the behavior that we want, right? Let's go back to the original here. I click the button once, it turns edit mode on. I click it again, it turns edit mode off, on, off, right? I want it to flip back and forth each time I click the same button, right? And so if I set this to true, it would just always turn edit mode on and I would never be able to turn edit mode off, right? I want it to be a toggle. So that's why we're doing this. We started out as false, and so I click this once, it'll go true. I click it again, it'll go false, true, false, true, false, true, false, blah, blah, blah. So that's the behavior that we want here in this specific case. That's not always the behavior that you want, right? But in this particular case, we want it to be a toggle. Yeah, like Doman said. All right, so that flips this state on or off. Now, yeah, it's a toggle switch, exactly. Yep. We also want to make sure that whenever we click this button right here, that the button changes, the actual label on the button changes as well. So I'm going to go ahead and update that as well. And that will be triggered by our editing state, right? If editing is true, we want the button to, say one thing. If editing is false, we want it to say something else. So that's logic that's also going to be controlled by this state. So under here in my button, I'm going to change this from being a hard-coded value, and we can just have some very simple logic and say, hey, if is editing is true, then what was this supposed to be? Save something? Save profile. I'll just copy this. Save profile. If it's false, whoops, then edit profile. Okay. So that's what we want there. Now, look, if I click now, hooray, I can see that that is working as intended, right? Success. Want to be able to toggle switch for my emotional state. Yeah, check or X, exactly. Ternary, yeah, we're using a ternary here. Now, I'm not saying that you should always use ternaries, but in this case, I think it's an excellent application of ternaries because it's a single line. We want it to really be just a one-liner, right? To keep things clean, it should just be a one-liner. Okay, so good start there. Got some of our logic in place. Now we also want to, whenever we click this button, we want the actual behavior of the form field itself to change as well, right? If we are editing, we want the box to appear. If we're not editing, the box shouldn't appear. And so, we want the form to respond to our editing state as well. So I think what we're going to want to do here is take our input box and control its visibility based on whether editing is true or not. Okay, so if is editing is true, the form should appear. If not, we can just skip it. So inside of my input tag here, well, first off, I need to wrap this. We're going to do some stuff in there, but first off, I need to wrap this and say, all right, if isEditing is true, show the form. If it's not, then don't. If isEditing is true, then show the input box. If it's not, then, well, if it's not, then really we just want to show, what do we want to show? If we're not in edit mode, we really just want to show whatever the first name value is, right? So if we're editing, show the form box. If we're not editing, just show whatever the first name value is. Yeah, so whatever this is. Okay. So if isEditing is true, show input box. If not true, then we just show, I think that's, well, first name value, right? So I'm going to take this from here. And I'm going to leave that empty for now. We'll replace that with the state value in a minute. Okay. And then I also need to close my brackets. Fence off my JavaScript. All right, cool. There we go. Okay, so now when I toggle edit on and off, if I go into edit mode, the box appears. I go out of edit mode, it disappears. Perfect. Now I can do the same thing for the last name box as well. So I'm just going to copy this logic and move it down here. Like so. There we go. Now my behavior should match up. Perfect. So we're getting there. Full Megaturner. Yeah, I don't know. It's debatable whether this is the way to do this or not. But I like it because it does illustrate something about ternaries. If you want them to be multi-line, you need to make sure that you wrap in parentheses. And this, you could make this a single line, I suppose, but yeah, I don't know. You might prefer this to be like a standard if else. Yeah, the Code Wars trained us for this. Yeah, I mean, personal preference plays a big role in this as well, right? Really, it's not that one thing is generally good or bad. It's what's your preference, what makes it readable for you. Okay, so we've done a lot of that off and on, and I think those are all the things that are going to be controlled by our isEditing state here. So now we can start to figure out what needs to display at any given point while the user is typing. I think I've captured everything. We'll see if I missed anything in a minute, I'm sure. All right, so input boxes. We need to make sure that our input boxes are behaving appropriately and capturing what the user is typing. So if we go back to the original example here, we can see that when I click edit, it needs to fill the box in with whatever the current first name and last name values are, right? It needs to fill those in by default. So I need to make sure that my input boxes have first name and last name as their default values. And of course that it's also being captured down here. So inside of my input tag, I can control what's displayed there using the value attribute. So I can just say value is, first name. And so there, now, as soon as I do that, we can see that it fills the form in by default with the value of first name. So I'll do the same thing down here for last name. And whoop-de-doo. Whoops. Caps lock was on, sorry. Okay. There we go. So that's partially working correctly now. And now as soon as I make a change to what's in here, I want it to capture that and not only store it in my state, my first name state, but also make it change down here as well, right? Because remember, this needs to be dynamically updating as I'm typing. If I try to type in here right now, it's not going to register my keystrokes. It's not going to register anything. So I need to initialize that behavior. Yeah, and we could hide the we could hide this in different ways too. Here it's not really necessary because our is editing true or false is controlling what gets displayed anyway, so we don't need to use hidden. But I mean, yeah, there's always other ways you could do this too, certainly. Um, so in order to capture what the person is typing, thank you, Dan. Sometimes. So in order to capture what the person is typing, does anybody remember what event handler we might need to use? What we used it before, right? When we looked at that example of the that billboard form that we filled in. Lockjaw says on typing. That's a good guess. On Donner, on Blitzen. What's a built-in event handler that you can use inside of an input box to capture differences? Ah, Les Carbonaro says on change. There we go. Yeah, an Oscriptor. Man, my first time chatters are always so good. Y'all are just like y'all are on it. You're just like coming in hot with the right answers. I love it. Welcome to the stream, Oscriptor. All right, coming in with the right answer. Good job. All right, so we can use on change, and what that'll do is it'll automatically capture anytime the user makes an entry in the box. Hi, hi, Oscriptor. So, and then in order for us to capture that, we just take the event. In this case, event refers to what's being typed. Take the event, and we want to update the state of the first name based on what's being typed, right? We want that to update every time the user types something new. We want to update the state of first name, and we can say set first name, and we want to set it to whatever the user is typing. And so in order for us to do that, I'm not going to ask this one. I'll just tell it to you. We want to set it to e.target.value. Okay. Now I think I'm missing a, oh, I need brackets here. Sorry. I need brackets and not parentheses. That's my bad. Oops. There we go. Hey, okay. So now the state of the first name should update. So now this will actually let me type in it because it's actively updating the state as I type and then displaying it back to me, right? Because we set the value of the input box. We set the value of the input box to be what's ever in our first name state. And now, since we're changing the first name state every time you type something, it's actually displaying what I'm typing. So there we go. And we can also do the same thing inside of the last name as well. So down here, do that, do this, and this. Oops. Set last name. Oops, sorry. Okay, and I think I'm missing a bracket somewhere. I'm sure I'll figure it out. Let's see. Oh, last name. There we go. Got it. Okay, now both of these should update when I type. Perfect. Perfect. Okay, I'm going to refresh this now. Yep, it's working. Dan says, no one wants to first time chat with a wrong answer, especially the way it super highlights your message. Hey, you know, if you're new to the stream, I'm never going to chastise anyone for a wrong answer. I love it when people contribute. And so whether you're a first time chatter or not, you shouldn't feel afraid to, throw your hat in the ring, throw your opinion out there. And, engage in the discussion. That's what I appreciate more than anything else is people who engage in the discussion, right or wrong. Sometimes a wrong answer will lead us to an even better discussion than the one we were having. For the comedic relief. Cue Anakin, it's working, it's working. I can hear that. I can hear that line. Anybody else play that pod racing game for the N64? I used to love that game. I sucked at it, but I loved it. Um, okay, so now that's working. So we're getting there. Um, and then I think so. Now when we toggle between edit and save, we want this to display whatever the value is. So we want the value of first name and last name to also display here. So I think in order to do that, all we're going to need to do is take the value of first name and the value of last name and have that display whenever we are not editing. There we go. Perfect. Now I think everybody's like, love that game. I think I remember that. My sisters hated playing with me. It was hard. Yeah, it was not an easy game. Wait, B works? Yeah, it's a tag we wouldn't normally use if we had CSS, right? Because we want to keep separation of concerns. But in this case, we don't have any CSS. So in the original, they have it as bold. So we gotta bold it somehow, and this is the easiest way. Yeah. Yeah, we can do strong too. Sure. Um, okay. Now the last thing I think we need to do here is make sure that any changes are actually updated in the text down here and are responsive as we type. Yeah. So instead of hard coding these values for hello Jane Jacobs, what we're going to want to do instead is just make them associated with whatever the current state is. So this should be super easy. All we do is we capture the first name value, put a space, and then capture the last name value. Hello. All right. So let's see if that actually works. I'm going to change this. Yep. There we go. We can see that it's updating as I type, right? And then if I refresh, it'll go back to default. Yep. I think it's working. Now, the reason that this is working and acting in this particular way is this is a very minor implementation, but this is one of the major reasons why state can be so valuable, right? We are updating two separate parts of the UI with the same information simultaneously. And in order to do that, the reason we're able to do that is by calling upon state, right? We're calling upon a single state to update two parts of the UI completely simultaneously. We don't have to tell it to do that. All we're doing is saying, hey, in this text space down here, just put whatever the state value is. And so whatever that state value is what's going to get rendered. Mine Wolf Jacobs. That is not my real last name, by the way. Federico says, I love state. Good. It's very it's hard to kind of get your head around at first, absolutely, but this is not the only time we're going to talk about it. We're going to be talking about it multiple times in multiple scenarios, and we're going to see even more useful applications of state as we continue through the documentation. So any questions on this? And it's perfectly valid to be completely in the weeds right now, and to be like, what the heck did they just do? That is a valid feeling to have. That's okay. What I would suggest is going back and doing this example yourself, puzzling through it, maybe going back to some of the simpler examples that we talked about farther up the page, and just playing around with them, editing the values, seeing what works and what doesn't, maybe trying an alternate solution that makes more sense to you. I'm not saying this is right, but try something else that makes more sense to you. And if that helps you understand it. But whatever you do, don't don't just sit on it and not understand it. Try it yourself and play around until you do get it. Trinae says, is the name being stored anywhere for long-term recall, like local storage? No, but not in this example. But that doesn't mean you couldn't do that. You could set up local storage fairly easily. We've done that a few times here on stream. You can set up local storage and just pass the values into it, and store them there. But or I mean, heck, you could store them in a database too. You could set up a backend and controllers and all that. Um, but here it's not being, if I refresh this, it's gone. Everything is, the state is set back to the initial values. But if you wanted to store them in local, you could. Sure. Okay, so we're not, and we're not going to do, that was the end of challenge 2. We're not going to do challenge 3 because I don't like it. But you can do it if you want. It's basically refactoring the same thing, uh, without using React, which I'm like, why would we want to do that? We have React. So if you want to try it, you can, but we're not going to do it on stream. Okay, any other questions? And we're gonna, this is, like I said, this is definitely not the only time we're going to be talking about state. As you can see over here on the left in the list of topics, we're going to be talking about state for a little while. Uh, Learning more about it, how we use it, how we change it, how we. I think what's going to be the most interesting is when we get to the part talking about how we share state between multiple components, right? Because so far all we've talked about is setting the state and then immediately using it in the same component. But the real magic of state happens when you can set state at like a parent level and then use it spread across multiple components to update them all simultaneously. So if you think about something where maybe, for example, you have like a page where the user is entering information, maybe they're searching for something, or something like that, and they type their text into a box, they click a button, and then multiple elements on the page suddenly change based on whatever they search for, right? Maybe they search for a keyword, and so it's going to bring up multiple options, it's going to bring up links, it might bring up a sidebar with more information. All of those things can be controlled by sharing state. Oh yeah, and I think that was, so Dan mentions, is it worth showing an example of how to set state based on previous state? Yeah, we can look at that. That's in here somewhere. Give me just a second. I know I've seen it. Yeah. So updating state based on previous state. So occasionally you may want to build a state on top of whatever's been passed as a previous state. So in this example here, we have age equal to 42. And the handler calls set age is age plus 1 3 times, right? And like conceptually, that makes sense, right? You take whatever the current value is and you add 1 to it. And if we were thinking about JavaScript in terms of like vanilla JavaScript variables, if I took a variable called age and I added 1 to it once, that would put it to be 43. And then if I did that same thing again, that would put it to be 44 and then 45, right? But React state, when we touched on this before, React state, calling that set function to set it to a new value, won't update that state variable if the code is still running, right? It'll update it as soon as that finishes and the component re-renders, that new value will be applied. But if we're in the same function here and calling set age repeatedly, you can see in comments that what it's doing is just saying 42 plus 1, 42 plus 1, 42 plus 1. And so after the click, age will only be 43 rather than 45. So how do we not do that? Isn't there another way? There must be a better way. And indeed there is. Um, so if we want to not have it do that, if we want to have it act more like a regular variable within the same function, calling set age multiple times, um, we can pass what's called an updater function instead of the next state. So the difference here is subtle, but if you look, you can see it. So what we're doing instead is still calling set age 3 times in order to update the state, but we're passing an arrow function that takes the initial value and adds 1 to it. So what it's doing is it's taking the value of 42 and then saying, all right, 40, it's passing 42 into this function and then returning 42 plus 1, right? Taking in current value, returning updated value. Taking in current value, returning updated value. Taking in current value, returning updated value. And so what that allows us to do is update, call set state multiple times within the same function and do multiple updates. And so again, that's called an updater function. It takes the pending state, which in this case is A, and calculates the next state from it, which in this case is A plus 1. So React puts the updater functions in a queue, and then during the next render, it will call them in the same order. So during the next render, it's going to call 42. It's going to call set age 3 times and perform all the operations. By convention, it's common to name the pending state argument for the first letter of the state variable name, like A for age. However, you may also call it previous age or something else that you find clear. React may call your updaters twice in development to verify they are pure. So that's a bit of a callback there, but in development mode, React runs in strict mode, which means it's going to call everything twice. And what that does is it helps you figure out any problems with your components or your functions where they aren't pure, and that any times where your components are going to return different values if they're called twice. Okay. And you can look at more, you can read more about updaters and see some examples down here. I'm happy to answer any last questions, but I do need to wrap up for today because I've kind of got a busy day tomorrow, so I need some time this evening to prepare. Yeah, I'm happy to answer any last questions before we wrap up. I never want to, cut anybody off if you're feeling lost and confused. But yeah, what we'll talk about next week is probably state structure, maybe sharing state. Yeah, we did cover a lot today. I'm fully aware of that. Good. Okay. Awesome. Well, feel free to ask any last questions before we wrap up. I'm going to look and see if we can find someone to raid, as always. Got to spread the love. If you have any recommendations on someone that you want to raid, feel free to suggest. Otherwise, we'll pick somebody from the list. Oh, thank you, Liz. All right, so the only person I'm seeing online right now is Team Vash, which is fine. We can definitely raid them. If you have any other recommendations in the software and game dev space, feel free to let me know right now. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and raid Vash. But I'm always happy to explore new raid targets too. Let's see what Vash is doing. Ooh, I see an empty chair there. So who knows? 50-50 chance they're at their desk when we raid them. You never know. All right, going once, going twice. Speak now or forever hold your raid. Okay. All right. I'm going to go ahead and roll raid Team Bash. I will see you all next weekend. We're going to talk much, much more about state, and that's really going to open some incredible doors for us as far as options with our user interfaces. And really unlock the full power of React and everything it can do to make our UIs much more dynamic and better. All right, Raid is starting now. I will see you all next weekend. Bye-bye.